Hey, what's up? It's cute what if this side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku found his lost Omega. Before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Destined. Both alphas, omegas, and betas have their destined partners. Upon turning 8 years old, one can hear the voice of their destined partner in their mind and communicate with them. This also means that with the first voice, their initial will appear on their wrist, but they will not be able to say their name, as it will not be heard no matter how much they try. There are 3 circumstances under which one will stop hearing their destined partner. If both meet in person and become aware of their connection, accepting it. If the tattoo is damaged in any way, such as a cut or burn, making it illegible, the connection will break. If the destined partner directly rejects the connection, it will sever the bond between them. The Omegaverse. Even with the emergence of quirks, humanity has still been divided into 3 species, hierarchizing humans into 3 groups. Alphas. Alphas are the superhuman individuals, possessing superior physical characteristics, making them stronger and more skilled when asserting themselves over others. They are overprotective of those they become attached to, and if they form a romantic relationship with an Omega, they become hostile towards any danger that threatens their partner. They command respect and intimidate lower-ranked species simply by their presence. Although discrimination among species is nearly non-existent today, SBMSN to omegas or even betas is sometimes necessary if they are deemed a threat to society. Their pheromones serve as a way to mark territory. By imprinting an omega with these, they signal that the omega is theirs and deter other alphas. When an alpha decides to stay with an omega and make them their lifelong partner, they mark them with a bite, leaving a mark on the neck that creates an eternal bond between them. Betas. Betas are the commonly known human race, without hormonal changes or the need to worry about unexpected changes or any type of heat cycle. Omegas. Omegas were once considered inferior. Physically, they are seen as weaker. However, they have adapted and sought ways to feel equal to alphas and betas. By nature, omegas seek the protection of an alpha, are nurturing towards their young, and can become hostile when their partner or offspring is threatened. Omegas experience a heat cycle lasting 48 hours, occurring every 2 to 3 months without prior warning. In some cases, it can be more frequent, happening monthly or even every 6 weeks. They can conceive even if they are male without difficulty, and during their heat, they become much more fertile. When in heat, they release a pheromone that attracts all nearby alphas, causing their bodies to reach high temperatures and making the need for intimacy their top priority. Their pheromones have a strong scent to identify them as omegas, which becomes more intense when they are in danger, serving as a call for help to their alpha. Once they create a bond with an alpha and are marked by them, their bodies will not respond to other alphas, making intimacy only pleasurable with their partner. This is why they remain close to their alpha, seeking protection. Omegas must take suppressants that are 90% effective in calming their heat and stopping the pheromones they emit. They can mask their scent if an alpha releases their pheromones around them to deter other alphas from approaching. He sat on the edge of the building, observing the city in search of any infractions or villains to confront. Lately, the streets had been quiet, and fortunately, crime had decreased significantly. When he heard his phone ring, he smiled upon seeing the caller ID. He always enjoyed receiving calls from his friends. Todoroki informed him that their former classmates wanted to meet up. Deku felt excited at the idea, as he missed his old days at UA, and seeing familiar faces would be quite beneficial. He accepted the invitation, feeling more motivated for the day. Recently, he had felt the weight of solitude. It wasn't that he couldn't visit his mother or hang out with close friends, but seeing everyone else flaunt their stable relationships was somewhat disheartening. He had resigned himself to the fact that he was born without a quirk, which led to his destined partner rejecting him, or at least that was what he had been told before their connection was severed. He was sure he would wander aimlessly forever. Everyone had a destined partner, as nature dictated. His only fortune would be to encounter another unfortunate soul like himself, but he knew that was nearly impossible. The chances were slim, and the voice of that boy still echoed in his mind. He had never felt even a hint of attraction toward others, knowing that only your destined partner could evoke those vibrant emotions that everyone craved. Still, he wished he could give himself a chance. After finishing his workday, he bid farewell to his agency members and decided to walk home, thinking it would be good exercise at night. For him, there was no real issue. He did it intentionally to catch those typical thieves who thought they could rob a civilian. It was amusing to see their faces when they realized they were attempting to steal from the symbol of peace, and his apartment wasn't too far away. As he walked, he heard noises coming from an alley and stopped, fully aware that many crimes occurred in the shadows, making it impossible for him to ignore. He heard a growl and sensed an Alpha and Omega presence nearby. A rough voice echoed, likely trying to assert dominance over an Omega. Fearing that the situation could escalate, he quickly intervened, noticing that the Alpha had cornered the Omega on the ground, striking him but holding back, knowing that the assailant was a civilian and likely wouldn't withstand a full-force blow. The Alpha staggered back, annoyed by the sudden interruption, and glared at Deku. Ignoring him, Deku extended his hand to the trembling Omega on the ground. The Omega hesitated but accepted the offer, recognizing him as another Alpha. Deku lifted him up and shielded him from the Alpha's reach, feeling his cheeks flush as he got a closer look. The Omega was the most beautiful one he had ever encountered, and his heart raced at the sight of those stunning reddish eyes. The Omega noticed Deku's reaction and blushed slightly as well. He questioned who Deku thought he was for interrupting his courtship. Deku replied that he doubted this was a courtship and warned the Alpha to stay back, threatening to call the police. As he pulled out his phone, the Alpha lunged at them. Instinctively, the Omega sought refuge against Deku's chest, fearing for his safety. Deku swiftly subdued the Alpha, knocking him to the ground, leaving him unconscious. He caught the surprise in the Omega's eyes at his decisive action. Dressed in civilian clothes, including a cap, glasses, and a mask, he often preferred to walk incognito to avoid fans, which explained why the Alpha hadn't backed down. The dim lighting of the alley concealed his curly green hair beneath the cap. He reassured the Omega that he would call the police. The Omega nodded, still trembling from fear, and stepped back slightly to allow Deku to make the call. He glanced at his attacker, now unconscious on the ground, feeling fortunate that Deku had appeared. He hated the thought of being unable to defend himself, but the situation had been overwhelming. Deku called the police, relieved to find a station nearby. The Omega seemed to be sending texts, likely informing someone about the incident. Deku asked if he was okay, and the Omega nodded, returning his focus to his phone. Feeling a bit embarrassed, Deku realized the Omega probably didn't want to talk to him. He looked up at the sky, noticing it was quite late. Omegas, being vulnerable, typically avoided being out at this hour, and most would steer clear of the streets. He noticed the Omega's breath in the cold air and decided to remove his scarf, wrapping it around the Omega. The Omega jumped slightly, surprised by the gesture. Confused, the Omega used the scarf to cover his cheeks, not wanting to reveal his emotions. It was the first time an Alpha had helped him in such a way, and he felt like a love-struck schoolgirl, experiencing a whirlwind of feelings after many years. Deku watched as the Omega diverted his gaze back to his phone, clearly not wanting to engage with him, or perhaps still frightened. Fortunately, the police arrived quickly, and Deku decided to leave the Omega in their care. He took one last look at the Omega, feeling resigned as he walked away, knowing he had to continue on his path. He hoped everything would be all right for him. Finally arriving home, Bakugo felt a lingering sense of fear. He never thought that the persistent Alpha would follow him home. It wasn't the first time he had encountered this Alpha. He often visited the flower shop and would unashamedly harass him. Bakugo had always rejected him, and his mother had to intervene several times when the Alpha tried to overstep boundaries or even used his voice to pressure Bakugo into going out with him. That day, his mother had to leave early, and it was his turn to close the shop and go home alone. He was no child. He knew how to take care of himself. However, that Alpha confronted him on a deserted street and cornered him in an alley. He took advantage of the fact that Bakugo couldn't scream for help. Bakugo was certain that the Alpha would take advantage of him, and the thought made him feel terrified. The Alpha managed to slip his hands under Bakugo's clothing, and he was on the verge of crying out of fear, as it brought back painful memories he thought he had buried. But then another alpha appeared and dealt with his aggressor. Bakugo was so frightened that he couldn't find the words to express his gratitude. He was sure that the alpha might not understand him anyway. Although he wanted to speak, the nerves and fear of the situation left him paralyzed. For some reason he felt anxious, and his cheeks burned as he tried to write a simple, "thank you," on his phone, but he lacked the courage to do so. By the time he finally managed to, he only saw the alpha leaving him alone with the police and a scarf that didn't belong to him. His mother welcomed him home and hugged him, relieved to know that he was safe. She had sent him worried messages because he was late, and he could only respond to ease her concerns. Although he wanted to know more about that alpha, he found his scent pleasant, and for some reason he felt shy when looking into his eyes. They seemed familiar in a way he couldn't explain. His mother noticed his unease and couldn't help but ask where the scarf had come from. Bakugo blushed again, wishing he could have returned it to the nameless alpha. He told her that the alpha who helped him had given it to him, thinking he might be cold. His mother observed how he trembled slightly while moving his hands and communicated with him in sign language, as she often did. She asked if the encounter had made him nervous. He shook his head and frowned, feeling annoyed. He decided to retreat to his room to avoid her silly questions. Once inside, he sighed, irritated by the entire situation. He didn't like feeling weak and helpless. It shouldn't be this way. But at 22, living with his parents, an alpha had to rescue him from his predicament. Not wanting to dwell on those feelings, he decided to sleep. He was arranging the last flowers of the day, which had just arrived, and his mother wouldn't stop nagging him about putting everything in its place before the end of his shift. He sighed as he finished and walked to the counter to sit down and prepare the accounts. After a few minutes, he heard the bell ring and looked up to greet a potential customer. The customer smiled at him, and Bakugo sighed inwardly as his peaceful afternoon vanished. Kirishima greeted him and asked how his day had been, teasing him about what trouble he had caused. Kirishima noticed Bakugo using sign language, having become quite adept at understanding his friend after much practice. He chuckled, feeling guilty for it. Bakugo explained that someone had lost their suppressors and blamed him, but he swore he hadn't hidden them. After the heat cycle, they found them under the pillow. Kirishima noticed Bakugo frowning and rolling his eyes. Even without the ability to speak, Bakugo was quite expressive, and Kirishima was sure he would have shouted if he could. Kirishima playfully accused Bakugo of taking advantage of his Omega. Bakugo denied it vehemently, insisting he would never do such a thing. Kirishima, knowing how Denki was, asked if he had sunflowers. Bakugo nodded and went to get them, planning to create a special arrangement for this occasion. Kirishima was a frequent customer, an alpha who often came looking for flowers for his Omega whenever he did something silly that annoyed him. Despite that, Kirishima was also the hero Red Riot. Bakugo had noticed one day when Kirishima had forgotten he was still in his hero outfit instead of civilian clothes. He had entered the shop, starting a conversation that felt too familiar for Bakugo to deny. From that, he easily deduced that Kirishima's partner was Chaggerbolt. Kirishima sighed, expressing how he sometimes wondered what he had done to deserve such a destined partner. Bakugo made a clear gesture of disgust at the comment. Kirishima hesitated to press further. His friend was an Omega who, in addition to not having a quirk, did not have a destined partner. He knew it was a sensitive topic for Bakugo. Everyone had a destined partner, whether they were Omegas, Betas, or Alphas. Kirishima still remembered Denki's cheerful voice in his head, chattering away the first time they connected. Not only that, but he also had Denki's initial tattooed on his wrist. It was as if fate had taken charge of uniting him with someone so special that he couldn't imagine life without them. But Bakugo always wore long sleeves, and sometimes in the summer he wore wristbands. Kirishima found it intriguing, but Bakugo had clarified on more than one occasion that he had no destined partner and had never heard the voice of one in his head when he turned 8, like every other child. He also had no initial adorning his wrist. Kirishima asked Bakugo if he would be interested in going out with someone. Bakugo stopped what he was doing and shook his head. Kirishima pressed on, suggesting he could introduce him to someone. Bakugo retorted that no one he knew interested him, and besides, everyone already had their destined partners. Kirishima insisted that he remembered Bakugo having a crush on someone, but Bakugo slammed his hand on the table, making Kirishima fall silent, realizing he had annoyed him. He noticed Bakugo's cheeks were flushed, a common reaction whenever that alpha was mentioned, one who unfortunately didn't even know Bakugo existed. Kirishima asked if he was throwing a tantrum. Just then, Mitsuki, the owner of the flower shop, entered from the back area. She noticed her son's flushed face, and Bakugo turned away, annoyed, and continued with his work. Mitsuki asked if Kirishima had shown him a picture of the hero Deku. The woman asked Kirishima if he was the one who sought out her son, and he laughed at what the Omega's mother said. Bakugo simply gestured, likely expressing frustration. Kirishima had discovered the truth by chance when he mentioned his day, including patrolling with Midoriya. The moment he said, Deku, the Omega turned so red that Kirishima thought he might be having a fever. His mother bluntly explained that her son had a crush on the symbol of peace, and she had offered to introduce them countless times, but Bakugo refused to budge. Kirishima urged Bakugo to accept his help after a failed attempt to go out the other night. He recalled how an alpha had attacked Katsuki on his way home, but another alpha had come to his aid. Bakugo had returned home flustered and nervous, which worried his mother, who lamented that he would never give her grandchildren. Bakugo simply raised his middle finger in response, focusing on arranging sunflowers. His friend expressed concern, reminding him that he was still an Omega and unmarked, making it risky to go out alone. Frustrated, Bakugo handed the arrangement to Kirishima, irritated that everyone saw him as defenseless. He knew he lacked a quirk, but he was not afraid to fight if necessary. Kirishima thanked him, reiterating that the offer still stood, but Bakugo firmly declined. Kirishima left, feeling resigned but hopeful that Bakugo could be a good match for his friend. He wanted to see how Bakugo would react to the alpha who made him blush just by being mentioned. Katsuki's mother expressed her concern, urging him to move on from the past, but he shook his head, insisting that what happened no longer mattered. He felt certain that no one would want him, especially as a quirkless individual without a voice. He sat with his classmates from Class A, always so energetic and friendly. Midoriya caught up with them while they drank and laughed. It had been an interesting week, yet he couldn't stop thinking about the lovely Omega he had helped days earlier. It was the first time he felt something since speaking with his destined partner. Kirishima approached Midoriya, casually asking if he was dating anyone. He noticed that Midoriya had a bit of alcohol in his system, just as he did. Uraraka scolded Kirishima, aware that everyone in class knew about Deku's situation, which was a sensitive topic since Izuku often felt down about it. However, by that point, Deku had resigned himself to his fate and wanted to move on. If he had a chance with someone new, he saw no reason not to try. When Uraraka asked if he was dating anyone, he replied that he wasn't. Kirishima excitedly suggested introducing him to someone, pulling him aside to talk. Deku was skeptical, knowing how difficult it was to date someone without the risk of their destined partner showing up and leaving him behind. Kirishima reassured him, insisting that he had a good feeling about this match, but there was something Deku needed to know. Curious, Deku listened as Kirishima smiled. He revealed that the person was a fan of Deku's. Although Deku loved his fans, he was cautious about dating one. Kirishima insisted that this was not that kind of fan and urged Deku to meet him, eager to see his reaction. Deku agreed, mainly because Kirishima explained that the person was a good friend of his and had been a follower for a long time. Meeting someone new could be fun, so he decided to go along with it. Kirishima waited for him at the station, and Deku felt curious as he mentioned they would visit a flower shop in a commercial area of the city. He wondered if Kirishima wanted him to buy flowers before their meeting. As they entered the shop, Kirishima greeted the boy behind the counter. Bakugo felt nervous, realizing there was a customer behind him. He considered finding his mother to talk to him, but Kirishima took his hand, insisting they go together. Deku felt anxious, noticing that the person Kirishima was talking to communicated in sign language, which he didn't understand. His cheeks flushed as he felt that familiar flutter in his chest. It was the same Omega from that night. Bakugo recognized the alpha with Kirishima, and as he removed his hat, mask, and glasses, he smiled. Bakugo felt heat rush to his cheeks, certain he was redder than he had ever imagined. Deku introduced himself, and Bakugo confirmed that he was indeed the hero Deku. Kirishima couldn't stop smiling, while Bakugo panicked, unsure how to respond. Deku apologized, explaining that he thought Bakugo didn't want to talk the other night and had misinterpreted the situation. Bakugo struggled to process this, feeling even more panicked. Kirishima, confused, asked Deku what he meant. Deku explained that he had helped an Omega who had been attacked a few nights ago, and that it was Bakugo. Bakugo was taken aback, realizing he had not been recognized. He questioned why Kirishima had brought him along. Deku did not understand what Bakugo was saying. He noticed Bakugo pulling out his phone, and despite his irritation, there was a hint of nervousness in his demeanor. Deku read the message on Bakugo's screen and smiled, realizing that Bakugo had likely been trying to communicate something important when he was attacked. He felt relieved to have been there to help Bakugo. Bakugo nodded and quickly left, overwhelmed by the situation. Deku was everything he had imagined, and while he knew his feelings had always been platonic, the fact that Bakugo had saved him and was genuinely kind, as he appeared on camera, was difficult to process. Bakugo hid in the small storage room his mother had, feeling foolish for his emotions. He and Deku had nothing in common, and his infatuation was based solely on Deku's heroic name. He regretted getting his hopes up for such a trivial reason. Deku was confused by Bakugo's actions but felt a sense of satisfaction seeing him so flustered. He thought Bakugo was the most beautiful Omega he had ever seen, and their encounter reignited the feelings he had when they first met. Mitsuki had heard the door slam and assumed her son had locked himself inside. Upon seeing Kirishima and his companion, she quickly understood the situation. Deku smiled, and Mitsuki appeared both surprised and excited to see him. She remarked that her son had not stopped thinking about Deku since he saw him at the UA Sports Festival. Deku blushed at this revelation, but then Bakugo stormed out, clearly annoyed by his mother's comment. Mitsuki teased Bakugo, asking if he had invited Deku out yet. Bakugo's face turned even redder, while Kirishima chuckled, finding the situation amusing. Deku mentioned that he would love to go out with Bakugo, causing Bakugo to drop his phone in disbelief. He thought that Deku was only saying this to please Kirishima and not genuinely interested. Bakugo felt that Deku must have someone destined for him and that this was merely out of pity. Kirishima noticed Bakugo's discomfort and reassured him that Deku was sincere. He communicated in sign language, wanting to keep their conversation private. He explained that everyone had a destined partner, and he doubted he was a better match for Deku. Kirishima encouraged Bakugo to simply go on the date, reminding him that Deku could always decline if it didn't go well. Deku watched them converse, feeling anxious about being rejected. This was his first time inviting someone out, and he feared Bakugo would turn him down. As Bakugo approached, Mitsuki watched with interest, grateful that Kirishima had managed to persuade her son. Bakugo accepted the invitation but expressed concern about their communication barriers. He could only communicate through texts, and he worried it might be uncomfortable for Deku. Bakugo showed Deku his phone, hoping he would reject the offer so that Kirishima and his mother would stop pressuring him. Deku assured him that he was fine with that arrangement and promised to try to learn sign language. Deku's smile caught Bakugo off guard, and he blushed, looking away. He opened his contacts app and handed his phone to Deku. Deku quickly added his number and handed his phone back to Bakugo. They both felt awkward and shy, unsure of how to proceed. Deku never expected to encounter such a charming Omega again, and Bakugo was even more attractive than he had imagined. Kirishima had never mentioned Bakugo's condition, but it didn't matter to Deku. He would have accepted Bakugo regardless of that detail and was determined to see this through to the end. He nervously rubbed his wrist, hoping that Bakugo would find someone too, so he wouldn't have to deal with the fear of getting hurt while trying to connect with someone. Chapter end. He felt nervous, far too nervous, as he looked in the mirror, unsure if he should go through with this. He had agreed to the date with the hero Deku, knowing he should have stuck to his initial rejection. But standing in front of him stirred something in his stomach. Since he first saw Deku at the televised sports festival, he had been captivated. He had decided to watch, a form of self-torment, as he had dreamed of being a hero himself, but that dream had been crushed. At first, he found it interesting to watch Deku fight against Endeavor's son. It was when Deku became the hero that he realized he had developed a small crush on him, something platonic and innocent that he knew would lead nowhere. He would blush every time he saw him on television or in a photo. He rolled up the sleeve of his sweater and glanced at the scar on his wrist. The initial of his destined partner now faded to the point where he had forgotten what it was and had forced his mother not to tell him. It no longer mattered. Deku had hurt him, and he would never forgive that. He was grateful it was cold season, allowing him to wear long sweaters to cover the scar that might reveal something he didn't want to discuss. He had agreed to meet Deku at a cafe in the city center, promising it would be a quiet place away from fans or press that could intrude. Bakugo didn't want to be the center of attention. He just wanted to end this and reject him to move on with his life. After all, Deku would eventually choose his destined partner. Stepping out of his room with nerves, he found his mother sitting in the living room with his father, sipping tea. They were likely waiting to see him before they left, their curiosity evident. His mother asked if they shouldn't be working, expressing her interest in his plans. Bakugo rolled his eyes, annoyed by their concern. He was no longer a child to be treated this way. He snapped back that it was none of their business, insisting he didn't want Deku to know where he lived and that he intended to reject him. His mother urged him to stop being so insecure, but he dismissed her, stating it didn't matter and left before she could press further. As he exited, he heard footsteps behind him, and his father caught up to him. He mentioned needing to go to the city center for some errands and offered to drive him. Bakugo could see the concern in his father's eyes. They worried about him, especially since being an Omega had brought him trouble. But he accepted the ride, knowing they wouldn't feel at ease if he didn't, especially after what had happened a few nights ago. Since then, his parents' paranoia had returned. At least his father dropped him off a block away from the cafe. He would die of embarrassment if Deku saw him arriving with his dad. Upon entering the cafe, he spotted Deku sitting at one of the tables in the back, focused on his phone while wearing headphones, likely watching a video. He walked over and gently tapped Deku's forehead to get his attention. Deku greeted him with a hint of embarrassment, quickly removing his headphones. Bakugo took out his phone and decided to send him a message, pointing to Deku's phone as he noticed the notification. He texted that he had just arrived and that it was no problem at all. Deku stood up and moved the chair for Bakugo to sit down. Bakugo accepted the gesture and decided to write a message instead of showing his phone every minute. He asked if Deku had waited long. Deku replied that he had arrived about 5 minutes ago. Bakugo thought he had arrived late and asked if he wanted to order something. Deku nodded and took the menu, choosing something neutral and not too expensive. This meeting was merely a formality for both of them, pressured by Kirishima and their mothers. Despite this, Deku felt nervous and didn't understand why. He suspected that by the end of their snack, he might be the one to reject Bakugo. He asked Bakugo if he could know a little more about him, feeling anxious. Bakugo looked confused, thinking it unnecessary to get to know each other better than they already did. He was mute and felt he had nothing interesting to share, while Deku was the symbol of peace, making any comparison seem pointless. Bakugo sent a message asking what Deku wanted to know as the waitress brought their orders. She observed the situation with curiosity but decided to step away to avoid making them uncomfortable. Deku asked Bakugo to talk about himself, just that. Deku found himself at a loss. Making friends had never been difficult for him at UA, but Bakugo was a different story because he hadn't intended to befriend him. Since Bakugo had arrived, Deku felt his heart racing, fearing he might run to the bathroom from nerves. He didn't want to ruin this moment. He had never felt such a strong desire to be with someone and get to know them. Bakugo wrote simply that he didn't have much to say. He was quirkless, mute, and worked at his parents' flower shop, and that was all. Deku read this and felt curious. He, too, had been quirkless, but thanks to All Might, that had changed. He noticed Bakugo's shrug, likely indicating that it was an uncomfortable topic, and he didn't want to upset him. Deku asked if it was interesting to work in a flower shop. Bakugo's response was filled with sarcasm, questioning if Deku was mocking him, given his status as the symbol of peace who had defeated the League of Villains. Deku quickly reassured him that he didn't mean it that way, emphasizing that every job was important and that he assumed Bakugo must enjoy it, Or perhaps he didn't, and he could have wanted something else. Bakugo laughed, noticing Deku beginning to stammer, a habit well known to those who observed the symbol of peace. At first, Deku didn't understand Bakugo's reaction since he couldn't hear any sound, but when he saw Bakugo's hidden smile, he understood. Bakugo tried to write while hiding his smile, feeling silly for finding Deku's nervousness amusing. He admitted that he liked working in the flower shop, but it wasn't what he wanted to do. With his condition, finding something else wasn't easy, and it kept his parents at ease. He regretted the last part, not wanting Deku to think he was a child needing his parents' help for everything. He was independent, but as an Omega without being marked, and without a quirk or voice, everything was complicated. His mother would worry too much, and he himself was still afraid of the idea of being alone. Deku asked what Bakugo had wanted to be. Bakugo hesitated to answer, knowing it would lead to deeper questions about his struggles, the reason he was there with someone he felt he wasn't destined to be with. He wrote that he wanted to be what everyone wants to be as a child. Deku read this and understood immediately, deciding not to ask more. He knew exactly how Bakugo felt, being a child who wanted to be a hero but lacking a quirk to achieve it. He then changed the subject, telling Bakugo he could keep the scarf. Bakugo looked confused, thinking Deku would question him further, but when he saw Deku point to his neck, he realized what he had done unconsciously. He had put on the scarf Deku had given him nights before. It was instinctive, the scent fascinated him, and he needed to feel secure in that moment. He blushed deeply and hid behind it, wishing the ground would swallow him up. He heard Deku laugh and wanted to escape. Deku commented that Bakugo was too cute. Bakugo looked up, surprised and flustered, instinctively signing to Deku, forgetting he wouldn't understand. He asked what Deku had called him. Deku tilted his head, not understanding, especially since Bakugo had signed so quickly. Bakugo nervously took his phone and wrote, asking if Deku had called him Kaken. Deku read it and felt terrible for noticing, but he simply let himself go with the moment. He apologized, saying it was his mistake, explaining that Bakugo's name was Katsuki, and he didn't mean to mix things up. Su madre sigo observándolo, esperando a que se de cuenta de que ha acomodado las mismas margaritas 4 veces. Ya había pasado más de un mes desde su primera cita con el hero Deku, while final su hijo no pudo recazarlo. Casi cada semana tenían un par de citas, y él juraba que hasta su humor había cambiado. Sobretudo, porque tenía un sonrojo algo permanente y sonrisas cursis se escapaban de vez en cuando. Esa sonrisa apareció justo después de que lo vio leer un mensaje, y desde entonces estaba en un trance de evidente enamoramiento. Su madre le preguntó cómo iban las cosas con Izuku, a lo que él respondió que bien, aunque dudaba de que fuera algo serios. Deku era mucho más de lo que había esperado, era amable, atento y bastante paciente. Al menos eso asumía, porque jamás lo había visto quejarse por su condición. Además, lo había pedido evitar lugares públicos o con mucha gente, ya que no le gustaba llamar la atención de ninguna forma y solo quería encontrar la manera de lidiar con eso. Pero no podía, por más que lo intentaba, se sentía cada vez más seguro con Deku, lo cual le parecía ridículo. Su madre rodó los ojos y decidió ir a su oficina a hacer las cuentas. Kirishima entró el local, pareciendo algo desesperado, y vio que Deku había legado sonriendo. Kaken se sonrojo y Deku se acercó a él, tomando sus manos. Deku le preguntó cómo estaba, y Kaken rápidamente sacó su móvil para escribir. Kirishima se acercó, ya que había sido ignorado por Deku, quien además había acaparado la atención de su amigo. Kirishima le pidió ayuda urgentemente, pero Kaken lo ignoró y continuó escribiendo. Deku leyó el mensaje y sonrió, sonrojándose aún más, mientras Kirishima seguía tratando de no ser ignorado. Kirishima insistió en que tenía una crisis, y aunque Kaken le dijo que estaba ocupado, Kirishima le recordó que era un cliente y le mostró un artículo en su móvil que decía que un fan había besado a Red Riot al ser salvado. Kaken se dio cuenta de que definitivamente necesitaba ayuda. Luego, pidió todos los girasoles que tuviera y dispuso a hacer un arreglo para Kirishima, al menos con eso la venta del día estaba asegurada. Kirishima le dijo que era un idiota por dejarse pasar, y Kaken respondió que lo había tomado por sorpresa. Deku los observó conversar mientras jugaba las flores para no interrumpir, pero decidió acercarse justo cuando Kaken estaba por terminar el arreglo. Kirishima le preguntó si habían besado, y Kaken respondió que no creía que lo hicieran, además de que eso debía acabar pronto. Kirishima, usando language de señas para que Deku no lo entendiera y avergonzar a su amigo, mencionó que Deku no dejaba de dejar lo enamorado que estaba de él. Kaken y sonrojó mucho, llamando la atención de Deku. Kaken intentó controlar sus emociones. No quería que Deku suspectara de su conversación, pero lo vio acercarse. Deku se colocó frente a él, lo tomó de la cintura y lo acercó a su pecho, tomando su mejilla y robándole un beso. Kaken quedó tan sorprendido que dejó caer el arreglo que estaba haciendo para Kirishima, quien se puso histérico tratando de rescatarlo antes de que se denara más. Deku se separó y sonrió al ver que el rostro de Kaken estaba rojo. Lo aseguró que no lo abandonaría y le preguntó si podían formalizar su relación. Kaken no entendía por qué, pero luego precisó la pregunta y se preguntó cuánto tiempo había pasado desde que comenzaron a entenderse. Deku smiled nervously, trying to gather his thoughts as he noticed Kaken looking somewhat upset. He admitted that since the day they met, he had been watching videos on how to learn sign language. He hadn't said anything before because he feared he wasn't ready, but now he felt confident that he understood most of it. Kaken was taken aback. Deku had understood what he had said to Kirishima about his insecurities. Kirishima quickly took out his wallet, left some money on the counter, and hurried away, needing to let them talk and get home with the flowers before his Omega saw the news. The bell above the store door chimed, breaking the trance they were in. Deku nervously scratched the back of his neck, hesitant to delve into what Kaken had mentioned. He revealed that his destined partner had rejected him years ago, assuring Kaken that he didn't need to worry. He confessed that he liked Kaken a lot and had even feared that Kaken might abandon him for his destined partner. Kaken noticed Deku's nerves as he spoke. He wished he could reassure Deku, but he felt guilty about the pain he had caused his own destined partner, which had severed their connection. Even though he had been forced into that situation, he still felt remorse. Kaken insisted that Deku shouldn't worry about it, but he had always lied to others about not having a destined partner. He didn't want to lie to Deku, especially since Deku could see the scar on his wrist where the initial of his destined partner used to be. Seeing Deku hurt by the mention of rejection brought back painful memories for Kaken, causing his throat to tighten and his face to tingle. He didn't want to think about it, but he felt as if he was suffocating, trying to scream but unable to. The desperation of those feelings lingered even after 14 years. He felt like he was drowning, only able to hear a voice pleading for him not to leave. Deku, not knowing what else to do, picked him up in his arms. Mitsuki heard Deku calling for help and rushed out, seeing her son having an anxiety attack, something that hadn't happened in years. She asked Deku to help carry Kaken to the back, lifting him into her arms and sitting him in a chair in her office. She approached her son, taking his hands in hers and assuring him that everything was okay, that he hadn't done anything wrong, and that he just needed to breathe with her. Mitsuki began counting to 10, inhaling and exhaling slowly until Kaken was able to match her rhythm. Eventually, Kaken calmed down, though he continued to cry. He mentioned needing to close up and take Kaken home. Kaken took his mother's hand and shook his head, insisting that he wasn't okay and needed to rest, refusing to let her go alone after what had happened the previous night. Feeling guilty for causing the earlier closure, Kaken was surprised when Deku offered to take him home. They both left the store, unsure of what to say. Kaken felt embarrassed that Deku had seen him in such a vulnerable state. Until that moment, no one had known about his anxiety attacks, and he wanted to keep it that way. Deku asked how Kaken felt, to which Kaken replied that he felt better but just wanted to sleep. They finally arrived at Kaken's home, and Deku smiled at him, but Kaken looked down, knowing that everything was about to change. Deku brought up his earlier question, asking for Kaken's answer. Kaken looked up, surprised, thinking that Deku would end things after everything that had happened. It felt like a mess that no one wanted to deal with. He questioned whether Deku truly wanted to deal with him, knowing he would never be able to speak properly and that his doctor had told him his anxiety would be a lifelong struggle. Yet, Deku insisted that he liked Kaken and was willing to do anything for him. Kaken felt himself blush at Deku's words, a silly smile appearing on his face, which made Deku smile in return. Kaken hesitated before nodding, feeling as if he were in a dream from which his mother would soon wake him. But when Deku kissed him again, he realized it was real. He was truly in the arms of the hero Deku, feeling cherished and protected. He had never imagined being in such a position, especially with Deku, but he wanted to savor those small moments. His insecurities whispered that nothing could ever be right, that he didn't deserve happiness in any form, while Deku simply wanted to love him for eternity. He woke up filled with excitement, remembering his mother telling him that when he turned 8, he would be able to speak with his destined partner if they were of age. He hoped that day would come. It was his birthday, and that thought thrilled him. He called out nervously, wondering if anyone was there, fearing silence. Without a quirk, he had often been teased by other kids, who said he probably wouldn't have a destined partner either. Then he heard a voice in his head responding, and although he felt confused, Izuku was overwhelmed with joy at hearing it. He introduced himself, saying that he believed they were destined for each other, as his mother had told him. Izuku felt a sense of confusion and unease. He recalled a conversation he had with someone important to him, a brief encounter that left a lasting impression. He remembered the voice, wishing he could go back and change how things unfolded. However, he now had Kaken, the Omega who made his heart race in a way no one else could. Though he didn't want to compare them, he sometimes felt similar emotions when he was with Kaken as he did with that other person. It was strange, and he hesitated to bring it up, especially after the events of a few weeks ago when Kaken had expressed insecurity about Izuku possibly leaving him for that other person. Even if Izuku wanted to, he didn't even know who that person was to consider it. That day, his patrol was uneventful. He sent messages to Kaken whenever he could, and Kaken always replied quickly. Izuku longed to see him, to breathe in his scent, and enjoy a peaceful evening together. Lately, he had been visiting Kaken almost every afternoon, eager to spend time with him. He felt exhausted, as balancing his duties as a hero and his relationship consumed most of his sleep hours. Yet, being with Kaken recharged his energy, and he couldn't turn down the chance to see him. As he patrolled an area, he noticed a villain wreaking havoc in a commercial district. The villain was powerful, causing destruction to concrete and buildings. Izuku quickly moved in, striking the villain to grab his attention. The villain retaliated with surprising strength, forcing Izuku to engage him directly. The crowd watched in awe, cheering for the symbol of peace, but they were also in the way, making it difficult for him to maneuver. The villain hurled Izuku toward a building, which began to collapse. Realizing civilians were in danger, Izuku positioned himself to take the brunt of the impact. Just before losing consciousness, he saw a massive ice barrier form around the villain, accompanied by the sound of police sirens. Meanwhile, Kaken was growing increasingly anxious. He had tried calling and messaging Izuku multiple times, fearing something was wrong. He had been browsing the internet out of boredom while working and stumbled upon various articles discussing Deku. It was embarrassing to read about how the hero had been buried under rubble after what seemed to be a devastating blow. No one knew more than that he had been taken to the hospital. Desperate, Kaken reached out to Kirishima, who replied that he had no information but would try to find out. Just then, Kaken received a call from an unknown number. Normally, he wouldn't answer calls from unfamiliar numbers, but given the situation, he felt it might be important. He hoped it was Izuku, just to hear his voice and know he was okay. "Hello," he answered, but only silence greeted him. "Hello," he repeated, still hoping for a response. "Is this Bakugo's number?" Annoyed, he stomps his foot irritably because his mother just left for a moment. He quickly sends a message, apologizing for the interruption. He receives a text back. "Sorry, Kirishima called me in a panic and I forgot to mention that you're mute. Midoriya is okay. He's in the hospital. Here's the address." He reads it and texts Kirishima to confirm, who replies that yes, the number belongs to a mutual friend. He messages his mother, letting her know he'll close up until she returns. She doesn't want him to go alone, but he can't wait. His Omega is too anxious and won't calm down until he's near the Alpha. He realizes it's not just him who is affected by Deku. His Omega seems fascinated by Deku's Alpha, feeling safe and protected with him. This is something he never thought he would experience with anyone. He leaves and, upon arrival, sends a message to the person who provided the directions. The reply asks him to wait in the reception area. When he sees the person, he's a bit surprised. He never thought he would have a conversation with him. It's the hero Shoto, whom he remembers well from the intense fight he had with Deku back in high school. Shoto greets him and leads him to Midoriya's room, introducing himself. He follows, and Shoto glances at him curiously, knowing he's the person his friend is dating. He's intrigued, especially since he's seen Deku upset about never being with anyone, and now he has an eager Omega waiting to see him. They arrive at the room, and Shoto stops Bakugo by taking his hand and pulling him back. Bakugo looks confused and tries to break free. He wants to see Deku. Shoto tells him to wait because Izuku's mother is inside. Bakugo hesitates at the door, unsure if he should enter. He's concerned about how she might feel about him being there, as he has no idea if she knows about him. Shoto reassures him that he simply thinks it's important for him to know she's inside. Bakugo trembles at the thought that she might not want him there, but his Omega is too anxious to see the Alpha, so he gathers his courage and steps inside. Shoto follows, knowing Deku appreciates having him there for support. Inside, he sees Izuku's mother sitting beside her son, holding his hand. She looks up and sees Bakugo standing in front of her. He notices her gaze. It's strange and clearly not welcoming, but she forces a smile. She asks if he's there to see Izuku, and Bakugo nods, feeling embarrassed. He bows slightly in greeting and she acknowledges him. Shoto approaches and pats Inko on the shoulder, telling her that the doctor says Izuku will wake up soon. Inko thanks Todoroki for helping her son, expressing her relief that Izuku has such a good friend. Shoto replies that it was no trouble, he felt he had to help. Bakugo feels uncertain about what to do. He wants to approach Deku and hold his hand, needing to feel that he's okay, but he senses Inko's protective aura over her son. Shoto notices Bakugo's discomfort and thinks of a way to ease the tension, not wanting the first meeting to end badly. He knows that if Deku wakes up to this situation, he will be devastated. Bakugo starts typing on his phone and shows it to Shoto, unsure if Inko knows about his condition. He hasn't even introduced himself yet. He types, "When will he wake up? I'm worried." Todoroki reads the message and sees Inko notice it, confirming what her son had told her. The doctor mentioned that Izuku would likely wake up in a couple of hours and that he was out of danger, so there was no need to worry. Bakugo nods, feeling Inko's gaze on him. He introduces himself, saying his name is Katsuki Bakugo and that he's dating her son. He hesitates to mention the last part, fearing she might already know, and lying would be worse. Inko nods and tightens her grip on Izuku's hand. She acknowledges that Izuku had told her about him a few weeks ago, and Bakugo senses a hint of discontent in her voice. He feels out of place and decides to leave for a moment to gather his thoughts. Shoto watches him go and doesn't blame him. He can feel the tension in the room. He apologizes for interjecting but asks Inko if she thinks she's being too harsh on Bakugo. Inko admits that she knows it's difficult for her to accept anyone with Izuku, as she doesn't want her son to get hurt. Shoto mentions that Midoriya told him Bakugo isn't with his destined partner either, and while he didn't provide details, he hasn't felt such a joyful aura from Deku in years. Inko sighs, still feeling uneasy. She knows that relationships outside of destined pairings are often challenging, and she fears her son might get hurt again. She understands that Bakugo isn't to blame, but as a mother, she worries, even as she tries to remain open to the idea of her son being with this Omega. Kaken looked at the doubtful message but decided to send it. Hearing it from him was an emotional bombardment, along with memories he wished he could forget. It had been years since anyone had called him that. It was a nickname from his childhood, used by friends, and the last time he heard it was from that person. the person who never deserved to have him as a destined partner. He hesitated, unsure if he should continue. He didn't want to make things awkward, especially since he was the one who. But he decided to let it go. He agreed to call him Deku only if he could do so. Deku nodded enthusiastically. No one called him by his hero name while he was in civilian clothes, but knowing it was Kaken made him happy. It seemed their date was turning out better than he had imagined. He was tired, with scraped elbows and knees that ached. He arrived home and locked himself in his room to avoid worrying his mother. Sitting on his bed, he covered himself with a blanket, trying to wipe away his tears, but a voice echoed in his mind. "Why are you crying?" The question came from his destined partner. Izuku realized that, by mistake, he had let his sobs be heard, something he had wanted to avoid. "Why do they bother you?" Izuku shook his head, not wanting to answer. He knew his destined partner couldn't see him, but he didn't want to share his feelings. He feared the disappointment, just like everyone else felt. Especially because he was an alpha without a quirk, the most ridiculous thing in society. "How can I call you?" Izuku asked, having spent a few days since their first conversation. His destined partner was finally talking to him, only promising to do so when he was ready. "I don't know. The kids call me Kaken. How can I call you?" Izuku thought for a moment, lowering his gaze as he wrapped himself tighter in the blanket. "The kids nicknamed me Deku because I'm useless. I like Deku, but why do they say that?" Izuku smiled, finding comfort in hearing his destined partner say that. "Kaken, what's your quirk?" There was a pause, and his destined partner didn't respond. Izuku felt he had asked a bad question, one that would have upset him if he were in Kaken's shoes. "I can make explosions with my hands." "That's cool." "Kaken is cool." "I'm not. I have to go. Goodbye." Todoroki had left the room in search of the Omega, knowing his friend would be upset if he woke up to find his partner and mother at odds. He arrived at the hospital entrance and saw Kaken typing on his phone. He placed a hand on Kaken's shoulder to get his attention, and Kaken looked up, surprised that Todoroki had followed him. Todoroki reassured him, explaining that he shouldn't take it personally or think that Midoriya's mother acted that way due to misunderstandings. She was simply protective and would behave the same way with anyone close to her son. Kaken responded by typing on his phone, expressing that Midoriya's mother didn't know him well and that he and Deku hadn't been together long, but he just wanted to be with him. Todoroki encouraged Kaken to come along, mentioning that when Midoriya was taken to the emergency room, he briefly regained consciousness and called out for Kaken. He believed that seeing him when he woke up would bring Midoriya joy. Todoroki offered his hand, and Kaken took it, feeling somewhat resigned and anxious about how Midoriya's mother would react to his return. Before they entered, they heard Deku's voice, causing Kaken to stop, gripping Todoroki's hand tightly in response. Deku was talking about dreaming of his destined partner and recalling one of their first conversations. He expressed to his mother that he knew it still hurt but assured her everything would be fine. When he mentioned Kaken, he described him as the most beautiful Omega. Todoroki noticed that Kaken was trembling with nerves, realizing that Midoriya didn't often speak about his destined partner, but it was clear there were still feelings involved. He observed Kaken's flushed cheeks and the way he gripped his phone and Todoroki's hand tightly. Todoroki sighed, feeling out of his depth with Omegas, as he was an alpha and had not faced many issues with the few Omega friends he had. He mentioned that Deku had called Kaken beautiful, which made Kaken flinch and frown even more, clearly flustered. Todoroki, resigned, opened the door and gently pulled Kaken inside to help him feel more at ease. Kaken, annoyed, tried to resist, but when he locked eyes with Deku, he couldn't hold back and rushed to embrace him. Deku welcomed him, understanding that Kaken must have been worried. Kaken apologized for worrying Deku, who scolded him for being reckless and putting himself in danger. Kaken signed his response, and Deku smiled sheepishly, acknowledging the truth in Kaken's words. After a brief moment, Todoroki announced he would leave, telling Midoriya to call him if he needed anything. As he departed, Inko watched her son take Kaken's hand and pull him closer, sitting him on the bed. She noticed the clear blush on Kaken's face. Inko mentioned she also needed to leave to make arrangements for Deku's care, but he insisted he didn't want to be a bother. Kaken interjected, saying he could take care of Deku, which made him blush at the thought. Inko was confused by their exchange, not understanding what Kaken had said to elicit such a reaction from her son. Deku reassured her that Kaken would take care of him and that he only needed a couple of days of rest. Inko insisted that Deku was injured and needed supervision, worried that if she left him alone, he might worsen. She observed her son looking like a scolded child as Kaken spoke to him, realizing that perhaps things weren't so bad after all. She knew how reckless he could be as a hero and often feared receiving bad news about him. If Kaken could keep him grounded, it would bring her some peace of mind. Inko thanked Kaken for looking after her son as she left. Kaken felt somewhat confused by her words, having expected her to dislike him after their first meeting. Deku took Kaken's hand and pulled him back to sit on the bed, noticing his blush and leaning in to give him a kiss, which Kaken shyly pushed away. He remarked that Kaken was supposed to be resting, to which Kaken playfully responded that his kisses were healing. Kaken reassured Deku that his mother could manage without him for a couple of days, avoiding admitting how excited he was about spending more time with Deku. After feeling overwhelmed with worry about Deku's well-being, he hoped that the conversation about their destined partners would remain unspoken, as Deku seemed focused on him instead. Kaken just hoped he wouldn't lose Izuku too. He had awakened, feeling an overwhelming pain in his chest. His eyes felt heavy, and he realized he had been sobbing in his sleep. He sighed, as it had been a long time since he had such a vivid dream about what had happened, a tragedy that had taken everything from him at the tender age of 8. Sitting up, he embraced himself in an attempt to calm down. No one could hurt him anymore, everything was supposed to be fine. He could still hear the voice of that boy in his head and missed him with all his being. That boy, without a quirk, he knew as Deku. So, when he was 16 and decided to watch the UA Sports Festival, he was captivated when he learned that the hero's name of the boy who had broken his bones was also Deku. He knew it was foolish to connect them, they were not the same person at all, as his destined one did not have a quirk. This coincidence was what had led him to associate them automatically, and since he was a teenager, he had fantasized that this Deku was his destined one. It seemed so silly to him now. Moreover, he could never have imagined that the symbol of peace would dare to look at him. Kaken was ill-tempered, silent, without a quirk, and still bore certain permanent scars from his kidnapping as a child. He was the least appealing Omega for any Alpha, especially since he was not the true destined one for the Alpha. Yet, for some reason, Deku wanted to be with him, and he accepted it. He knew it could never be a truly serious or lasting relationship. He could only wait for Izuku to leave him for his true destined one, a thing he wished would never happen. But eventually, it would, and Kaken would be alone again, something he had accepted years ago. He left and quickly headed to Deku's house. Deku had told him that Todoroki would help him settle in, and Kaken could see him there. He was about to leave after showering and bundling up, but his mother stopped him before he could go. "Hold on, did you take your suppressants?" "Why?" It wasn't the time for his heat. Kaken's mother expressed concern about him going to the house of an alpha he was dating, suggesting that the scent could unintentionally provoke him. Kaken insisted that nothing would happen, and he hadn't even. He felt a rush of embarrassment as he realized what he had said to his mother, who smiled playfully at his reaction. He just wanted her to leave him alone. Mitsuki sighed and handed him the medication along with a glass of water, knowing that Izuku was a good person but also aware that her son was completely inexperienced in these matters. An Omega in heat living with an Alpha was too risky. She asked if someone would come to pick him up. Kaken confirmed that Todoroki, Deku's friend, would help him return, assuring her that everything was fine and that he wasn't a child anymore. Mitsuki acknowledged his independence but reminded him that he was still vulnerable. The memories of that night haunted her, and she took his cheeks in her hands, expressing her concern. Kaken averted his gaze, feeling embarrassed. He understood how difficult those months had been for her when she didn't know where he was, and when she finally found him, she had become a fiercely protective Alpha. Despite his fear back then, Kaken had decided to work with her and continue living at home, as he was still an Omega who feared being completely alone and exposed. After receiving a message from Todoroki, he left, knowing his mother was still uneasy about him being with Deku, but she was resting and couldn't do much. He got into the car, where Shoto greeted him. Kaken nodded, focusing on his phone to distract himself from the nerves he felt about going to Deku's house. Upon arriving, he found a spacious apartment in one of the city's most beautiful areas, which didn't surprise him, given the peace symbol associated with Deku. Todoroki opened the door, and as Kaken stepped inside, the familiar scent of Deku enveloped him, causing a blush to rise to his cheeks. Todoroki noticed and led the way, allowing Kaken to follow. He mentioned that if the scent affected him, there was an extra room that Midoriya rarely used, where he could lock the door and call either him or his mother. He informed Kaken about Deku's medications and schedules, stating that he hadn't eaten breakfast yet and needed to do so. Apologizing for being late to patrol, Todoroki left. Kaken was left alone and reviewed the instructions given to him. It wasn't too difficult, so he decided to check on Deku to ensure everything was alright. As he opened the door, the scent inside intensified, making him blush and feel a flutter in his stomach. He saw Deku sleeping under the covers, still bandaged on his arms. Closing the door, he resolved to prepare something for Deku to eat when he woke up and could take his first medication of the day. Searching the kitchen, he realized that the alpha didn't have many ingredients, likely not eating properly. He huffed in irritation, planning to scold Deku about it once he was better. Meanwhile, Deku woke up, feeling that sleeping in his own bed was the best medicine for his recovery. He checked the time and realized he had slept for a few hours. Sitting up and complaining slightly, he was relieved to find he could move. A familiar scent wafted to him 2 scents, one he recognized immediately, making him smile. He got up slowly, knowing he shouldn't, but he felt compelled to follow that scent. Entering the kitchen, he found Kaken, his cute Omega, cooking while wearing an oversized apron that Deku had never seen before. He couldn't decide what smelled better, Kaken or the food. He wrapped his arms around Kaken from behind, burying his face in his neck and inhaling his scent. Kaken, startled by Deku's sudden movement, jumped and blushed at the gesture. Deku noticed the sigh from Kaken, who seemed confused by it, but he could see the redness on his cheeks and realized the effect of his actions. Kaken insisted that Deku should be in bed and would bring him breakfast shortly. Deku protested, not wanting to be a burden, but Kaken playfully tapped him on the head with a large spoon, telling him to stay put. Kaken's tone made Deku retreat, glancing back to see Kaken still blushing and fidgeting with the apron, likely trying to calm his nerves. Deku smiled, deciding to return to bed, knowing that Kaken would be there to take care of him, and he didn't want to miss the chance to eat what Kaken had prepared. After finishing cooking, Kaken had made something simple, given the limited ingredients available. He took the medications and a plate to bring to Deku, who was sitting on his phone. The sweet scent enveloped Kaken, making him blush as he tried to calm his own feelings. Deku looked up and smiled, attempting to get up, but Kaken quickly extended the food for him to take. He insisted that Deku should not get up and needed to rest without exception. Deku acknowledged this but expressed his desire not to be a bother. Kaken reassured him that it was no trouble and urged him to eat, mentioning that the apartment was a mess. Deku insisted it had been chaotic long before, attributing it to his busy hero life. Kaken, feeling frustrated, held back the urge to hit Deku with a pillow and left the room, determined to ignore him. He couldn't understand how Deku expected him to overlook the mess. It was annoying to be there and see the chaos. Deciding to clean up, Kaken thought it would help distract him from his nerves about the scent and being in the apartment of the alpha he was dating. Kaken helped Deku with the mess, realizing that it wasn't as chaotic as he had initially thought. Deku simply didn't have time for a thorough daily cleaning, so he started washing the dirty dishes he had used to prepare breakfast. He didn't notice the footsteps approaching until a figure stood beside him. When he turned, he saw Deku looking at him with a strange expression, but Deku's gaze was directed downwards, specifically at Kaken's exposed wrist. Kaken quickly covered it with his hand and looked away, feeling embarrassed. Deku gathered his courage and spoke, assuring Kaken that he wouldn't ask any questions or put any pressure on him. He recalled Kaken's earlier words about not worrying about his destined partner, but seeing the scar on Kaken's wrist made him understand why. The initial of Kaken's destined partner was impossible to read, marred by an X marked with 2 cuts. If the initial was damaged, it affected the connection between them. Kaken trembled at the thought, knowing it was a sensitive topic for anyone who had experienced something similar. He didn't want to have another panic attack in front of Deku, so he dried his hands and walked to the living room, trying to calm his nerves. Deku followed him and sat beside him, taking his hand to offer support. Kaken instinctively leaned against Deku's shoulder, counting in his mind to distract himself from the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. After a few minutes, he could breathe normally but didn't want to pull away. He wrapped his arms around Deku's and buried his face in his shoulder. Deku embraced him tightly, feeling a slight pain in his body from his previous injuries but holding back any complaints, knowing Kaken needed him. Eventually, Kaken pulled away and took a deep breath to steady himself. He apologized, but Deku reassured him that everything was fine, smiling. Kaken felt his cheeks flush and grimaced, trying to suppress a smile at Deku's understanding nature. Reacting quickly, Kaken stood up and took Deku's arm, leading him back to his room. Once there, he playfully pushed Deku onto the bed and threw a blanket over him. Kaken knew he should rest, but he worried about Deku and asked if he was okay. Deku nodded, though he wasn't entirely fine himself. He didn't want those bad memories to bother him, but he couldn't stop thinking about the scar on his wrist and how Deku might be feeling about it. Kaken didn't want to touch on that topic, fearing that Deku might misunderstand. He knew that eventually, Deku would notice, but he had hoped it would be much later. Deku then suggested they watch something to distract themselves, pointing at the television. Kaken agreed but felt embarrassed at the thought of lying down next to Deku in his bed. He was about to flee from the idea when Deku pulled him back, wrapping his arms around him. Kaken wanted to protest but was too nervous to move. Deku simply held him at the waist and turned on the TV. Kaken realized that was Deku's intention all along. He wanted to believe that, due to his condition, nothing more could happen, but the thought made him blush even more, considering that things could escalate beyond simple affection. Deku whispered for Kaken to relax, promising not to do anything. Kaken, annoyed, playfully hit Deku on the head, causing him to laugh at Kaken's reaction, which only made him blush deeper. Deku resumed searching for a movie, unaware of Kaken's expression. Kaken felt a strange flutter in his chest and a wave of melancholy wash over him. For the first time, he noticed the initial on Deku's wrist. It was a K. He didn't know what to think. It shouldn't mean anything, but it was the same letter as his own name. He feared that Deku might decide to pursue him because of this, even though he knew he would always be just a replacement for what Deku had lost. Kaken didn't know the story behind why Deku was not with his destined partner and was afraid to ask. Deku had assured him not to worry about it, but seeing that initial sent his mind into a spiral. Deku noticed that Kaken's scent had changed dramatically. Even without marking him, he could easily read Kaken's emotions and sensed that he was agitated. He asked if everything was okay, to which Kaken replied that it was his first time being close to someone like this. He lied a little, though not entirely. The thought of lying next to an alpha in his bed without being married made him nervous. However, they were not doing anything inappropriate. Kaken suddenly felt embarrassed as he remembered how inexperienced he was in romantic matters. He didn't even really understand how it worked. When was SEC supposed to be a topic of conversation in a relationship? He doubted that Deku wanted to be NTMT with him. He always felt that as an Omega, he lacked any charm for alphas. Without a voice, without a destined partner, and without a quirk, Kaken felt he had everything to lose in any relationship. Deku gently wrapped his arm around Kaken's small waist, lifting him to sit on his lap, facing away from him. Kaken trembled but noticed that Deku simply adjusted him in front and hugged his stomach protectively. The scent of Deku enveloped him, and he realized that it was quite comforting, as if Deku were trying to calm his troubled thoughts. Kaken expressed his feelings to Deku, turning to make it easier for him to understand. Deku looked at him skeptically. He insisted that since the day he saw Kaken, he couldn't stop thinking about him. He swore that Kaken was the most beautiful Omega he had ever seen, and appealing was an understatement. Kaken felt his cheeks flush and lightly slapped Deku, just to let him know he was embarrassed. He warned that if Deku tried anything he would tell Kirishima to kick him. Deku apologized, promising not to do anything for now. Kaken questioned what he meant by, for now, but Deku pointed out that the movie was about to start. Kaken stuck his tongue out at Deku, annoyed by his comment, although he had to admit it didn't bother him too much. His Omega was happy to know that Deku thought of him that way. He truly wanted their relationship to become what he had always desired, someone to love and who would love him back. He wished that Deku were his destined partner so he could claim him as his own, not just the person represented by the initial on his wrist. As he drifted off to sleep, he was awakened by a sob, finally having found some peace. Trembling, he sat up and murmured in concern. He realized the crying was coming from Deku. When he asked if Deku was okay, he received a hesitant response. Kaken could tell Deku was lying and pressed for the reason behind his tears. He hated hearing Deku cry. It made his stay in that room feel even worse. Deku's laughter was the only thing that encouraged him, and knowing that he was also struggling hurt deeply. Kaken urged Deku not to mock him, asking what was wrong. There was a pause as Deku contemplated whether to reveal the truth. He feared that if he did, Kaken might not want him anymore, but he knew they would eventually have to face the truth. He confessed that he didn't have a quirk and that the other kids mocked him for being an alpha without one. Kaken wanted to comfort Deku, but then he heard footsteps. The alpha who usually took care of him entered the room and grabbed him roughly by the neck. He scolded Kaken for talking to his destined partner. Kaken trembled in fear, and the alpha slammed him against the wall, causing him to fall onto the bed, groaning from the impact. The alpha commanded him to reject Deku, using a tone that made Kaken shiver with dread at the thought of disobeying. But the idea of hurting Deku terrified him even more. Kaken shouted that he didn't want to do that. He cried out, feeling torn apart inside. The alpha, annoyed, pulled out a knife, showing its edge to Kaken. He threatened that something could happen to his parents or to him if he didn't comply. Kaken could hardly stop shaking and sobbing. He didn't want to do it. Deku was the only good thing in his life at that moment, and he knew that rejecting him would mean losing him forever. He was aware of the danger that awaited him if he did what the alpha wanted, but fear consumed him, especially when his parents were mentioned. The alpha's commanding voice struck at his instincts, leaving his Omega terrified. The alpha demanded that he act. Kaken shouted that he didn't want a destined partner like Deku, who was quirkless and useless, and that he hated him. Deku, in tears, apologized for not having a quirk, promising that he would work hard to become a hero like All Might and protect Kaken so he wouldn't have to cry anymore. Kaken listened to Deku's pleading, wanting to stop but feeling conflicted, especially after that last statement. The alpha noticed Kaken's hesitation and pressed the blade against the boy's neck. Kaken screamed that he didn't want Deku, calling him ridiculous for being a quirkless alpha. The pain in his chest was overwhelming as he felt the weight of his words. The man in front of him grabbed his wrist and cut into his skin where his destined partner's initial was. The pain from the cut felt minimal compared to the anguish swelling in his heart. He felt everything crumbling around him, and his tears flowed as bitterness filled him. The connection was severed. The alpha announced that everything was almost ready for Kaken's auction in a few weeks, calling for a first aid kit. As the alpha pressed a cloth against the wound he had inflicted, he summoned his subordinates. Kaken was exactly what they needed, a quirkless Omega who couldn't defend himself and lacked a destined partner to connect with emotionally. He was the perfect merchandise for alphas with malicious intentions willing to pay for quality. They applied alcohol and bandaged the wound, but Kaken couldn't stop crying uncontrollably. The hurtful words he had said to Deku echoed in his mind. Everything he had said was a lie. He had only spoken out of fear of being hurt. He felt like a coward, and Deku had paid the price. He would never see him again, nor would he ever know if Deku could still love him after all that had happened. Not at all. Days passed, and he sat staring at the wall, still feeling the overwhelming pain in his throat. He had been sedated, and when he woke up, his throat hurt so much that he was warned not to attempt to speak, as it would only make things worse. He tried, as he did every day before, to communicate with Deku, desperate for a response. He hoped to regain their connection. However, the difference this time was that despite his efforts and the pain, his voice was gone. They could not take any risks. The connection with his destined partner had to be completely severed. He shouldn't even attempt to speak to him. Moreover, the alphas who intended to buy him had no interest in hearing him talk. He was the perfect Omega for their purchase, one without a voice, without a quirk, and without a destined partner. Kaken knew he had nothing left, and even if he found Deku, he was sure that Deku would no longer want him. Kaken woke up to find himself in Deku's arms, having fallen asleep after curling up next to him while watching a movie. He was crying from the bad memories, but being in Deku's embrace made him feel safe, as if everything had just been a bad dream, a nightmare that never happened. Yet, he looked at his wrist with the scar and knew that wasn't the case. He quietly got up and saw Deku sleeping peacefully. He left the room and finally let out a deep sigh, releasing the tears he had held back. He didn't want to worry Deku, much less talk about the topic. He feared being judged for what he had done. He knew that no one should forgive him. He walked to the living room and saw his phone buzzing with messages from his mother, worried because she hadn't heard from him. He had promised to keep her informed of any situation that might arise. He replied and heard the front door open. Todoroki had entered. Quickly, he wiped his face with his sleeves, but Shoto noticed his concern. He asked if Kaken was okay and if Deku had done something to him. Kaken shook his head quickly, but Shoto looked skeptical, and Omega crying couldn't be for nothing. He pressed further, asking if Kaken was sure, and offered to take care of Deku if he had hurt him. Kaken hurriedly typed on his phone that everything was fine, that Deku was asleep and he was okay. Shoto acknowledged this but pointed out that Kaken had been crying, and while he didn't know how to handle Omegas, it wasn't a common occurrence. He asked again if Kaken was really okay. Kaken looked at Shoto, confused by his concern. They barely knew each other and had spoken little. He wondered why Shoto cared so much. Shoto explained that he was friends with Deku, but that didn't justify hurting someone. He added that since Kaken was friends with Kirishima and Deku, he had to look out for him, even if Kaken didn't want it. Kaken felt embarrassed but was too vulnerable to respond with anger. He simply nodded, and although Todoroki didn't seem entirely satisfied, he decided to let it go for now. Shoto mentioned he had come to take Kaken home as promised and that he would deal with Deku that night. Kaken nodded and gathered his things. He wanted to say goodbye to Deku but feared waking him and revealing his swollen eyes. He decided to leave, and when he got home, he tried to avoid his mother. Unfortunately, he ran into her in the hallway, and she quickly intercepted him. She asked if he had been crying and if Izuku had done something to him. Kaken quickly tried to calm his furious mother, who remained skeptical. She pressed him on why he had been crying. He didn't want to tell her, knowing she wouldn't let the topic go and might form a negative impression of Deku. He explained that he had fallen asleep and dreamed about why he was in this situation, feeling like he had nothing. Mitsuki saw how her son struggled to articulate his thoughts, trembling at the mere thought of it, and understood everything. She knew how difficult this topic was for him, having dealt with the aftermath herself. She embraced him, allowing her Omega to feel safe with her Alpha. In that moment he felt like a child again, wanting to be held by his mother and not let go. Everything was about feeling secure. She reassured him that everything was fine and that nothing he had lost made him less worthy, which was why Izuku appreciated and cared for him. Kaken heard her words but didn't want to question them further. His Omega was too happy being with Deku, and he wanted to be selfish for once and let himself enjoy it, even though he knew it was a fantasy that would eventually shatter. After all, Deku had his destined partner with the same initial as his, a constant reminder that he was a replacement, one who would likely be discarded once Deku realized his worthlessness. Kaken remembered how much those words had hurt, especially when the connection was severed, confirming their sincerity. His destined partner had rejected him for not having a quirk. He knew it would happen. It was obvious that no one wanted him for that reason, and he had to deal with it throughout his childhood and part of his adolescence until he met All Might. He had chosen his hero name because of his destined partner, and a part of him felt he had lost his dignity in doing so. Yet he hoped that his partner would recognize his name and come back to him once he saw him with a quirk. But he knew that would be impossible. His partner probably didn't even imagine that the crying child and the symbol of peace were the same person. At first, he held a grudge. The cruel words had been painful. But over the years, he realized that his destined partner sounded sad when he said them, and he wanted to believe it wasn't intentional, perhaps just the words of an immature child. He tried to comfort himself with that thought. When he woke up and didn't see Kaken beside him, He felt lonely. For the first time, he had held an Omega in his arms while they slept, and his alpha had been overflowing with joy. But for some reason he remembered his destined partner's words, which only made him feel downcast. The door to the room opened, and he saw Todoroki enter with his arms crossed. He mentioned that he shouldn't interfere, but when he went to get Bakugo he had found him crying. Deku saw the worried expression on Todoroki's face, and a knot formed in his stomach. Kaken had been crying? That worried him. He asked if Kaken had really been crying, stating that they had only been sleeping, although he remembered that before sleeping something happened, and while it wasn't bad, it left him uncertain. He recalled how he had seen Kaken's wrist, and it was clear that Kaken felt uncomfortable about it. Todoroki scolded him, reminding him that he needed to be more attentive, especially with an Omega who wasn't his destined partner. Deku sighed, knowing Todoroki was right. He was inexperienced in relationships, and Kaken was unlike any other Omega. He was special to Deku. He admitted that this was new territory for him and suspected that Kaken was hiding something, but he didn't want to pressure him. Todoroki pointed out that Deku had given Kaken a nickname that was the same as his destined partner's name. He cautioned that when Kaken found out, he would be devastated, and he didn't deserve that. Deku thought deeply about it. When he had chosen the nickname, it had been instinctual because Katsuki's name matched perfectly. However, he realized he had done it out of the emotions he felt when he was with Kaken, which reminded him of his destined partner. He acknowledged that it was cruel, but Kaken had accepted the nickname and even seemed to like it. Deku explained that he hadn't intended any harm. He had lost his destined partner long ago and had come to terms with it. Kaken was everything he wanted in this life, and even if his destined partner returned, he doubted he could let Kaken go. Todoroki suggested that Deku should consider searching for his destined partner in the records, at least to close that chapter and let it go. Deku had thought about it countless times but didn't feel ready to face that pain again. The rejection had been painful, and confronting it in person could shatter him completely. As he stood up, he took in the sight of his clean and organized apartment, something he hadn't seen in a long time. The scent of Kaken filled the air, and he couldn't help but blush. With Kaken by his side, the thought of rejection felt insignificant. Perhaps he needed to reconsider this seriously. The next day, he waited for Kaken on the sofa. When Kaken arrived, he scolded Deku for not being in bed. Deku reassured him that he was feeling better and just wanted to see him as soon as possible. He took Kaken's hand and pulled him closer, sitting him on his lap and wrapping his arms around his waist, inhaling the sweet scent of caramel. Kaken blushed deeply and tried to pull away, embarrassed, but Deku's grip was firm, and Kaken wasn't genuinely trying to escape. The love from his Omega overflowed as they sat together. Deku wanted to ask Kaken about his feelings but didn't want to pressure him into discussing anything that might be sensitive. He told Kaken that if anything was bothering him, he could talk to him, as they were partners and he was there for him. Kaken replied that everything was fine, but he was lying. He hadn't slept well the night before and had nightmares, hating to feel vulnerable about it. Deku noticed Kaken's dark circles and slightly swollen eyes, and with concern, he lifted Kaken into his arms. Kaken instinctively clung to Deku's neck, fearing he might fall. Though Kaken was light, Deku's quirk and well-trained body made it easy to carry him. Kaken looked confused and wanted to protest, believing Deku should be resting. However, Deku took him into his room, pulled up the blankets, and nestled them both under them. Kaken felt a rush of emotions as Deku's scent enveloped him more intensely in the bed. He was in Deku's arms, and Deku simply adjusted to let Kaken rest between them. Deku noticed that Kaken looked tired and urged him to sleep, promising to protect him from anything. It was clear that Kaken hadn't rested well the previous day, and as they lay together, he quickly fell asleep. Kaken appeared confused and embarrassed, but he was undeniably exhausted. He inhaled Deku's scent and felt an overwhelming sense of calm. He had planned to make food for Deku, but seeing Deku's insistence, he reluctantly accepted. Deku sighed in relief as Kaken fell into a deep sleep after a few minutes. He loved watching him, and the previous day, he hadn't fully appreciated it as he had also fallen asleep. Kaken instinctively curled up closer to Deku. Deku felt like he might collapse from the emotions swirling inside him. He had never felt this way about anyone before, and his stomach fluttered at the sight of Kaken sleeping. If he had to define the word cute, it would simply be Kaken. With that realization, he wrapped his arms around Kaken even more tightly, wanting to protect him completely. He wished to stay like this forever and began to think more deeply about their relationship. They had only been dating for a short time, but he was certain he wanted to take all the next steps with Kaken. The thought of proposing the next step crossed his mind, but he feared that Kaken might feel pressured. He knew he needed to wait a little longer. Even the idea of living together, though appealing, would not be easy for Kaken. He tried to calm himself, realizing he was overthinking things. They hadn't even been together for a year yet, so it was too soon to consider such things. Yet he was certain that Kaken was his Omega, even without a mark. He definitely wanted to be with this Omega forever. He sat waiting, observing with curiosity as Kirishima settled the infant into his chair. The little one giggled, tapping his hands lightly on the table. Kirishima laughed, watching him babble as he attempted to sing a children's song he had likely heard on television that morning. Kaminari entered, handing Kirishima a small red bowl and matching spoon themed after Red Riot. He mentioned that dinner was almost ready. Bakugo simply nodded in response, showing patience. Kirishima had invited him for dinner before, and it wasn't the first time. Bakugo recalled how Kirishima had insisted he meet his partner, especially since Bakugo was the one who often made the arrangements that Kirishima enjoyed. They had developed a good rapport, and the couple liked having him over for dinner. Although Bakugo would never admit it, he appreciated his friendship with Kaminari. As an Omega without a voice and quirk, forming friendships throughout his academic journey had been nearly impossible. When Kaminari had shown sympathy towards him, Bakugo felt a sense of happiness. At least he felt more comfortable talking to him in general. Kaminari, as a hero, was quite lively and friendly. Bakugo struggled to express himself with others, and his condition was a barrier. However, Kaminari had learned sign language after they met, which allowed him to understand Bakugo better. Bakugo warned Kirishima that the baby might make a mess, noticing that the food was about to spill from the spoon. Distracted, the little one took the opportunity to hit the plate, splattering Kirishima with the puree. Kirishima scolded the child, while Bakugo chuckled at the scene. Bakugo suggested that Kirishima see if he could do better, handing over the plate and spoon, and left to change, leaving Bakugo alone with the baby. He sighed, resigned, and proceeded to feed the child. For some reason, the little one always seemed calm and cheerful around him. Bakugo smiled as he watched the baby laugh and clap happily with each bite. Having a baby seemed cute to a certain extent. Kaminari finally entered with a pot of what he had prepared and curiously observed his friend with the task he had assigned to his husband. Kaminari asked if it wasn't supposed to be Kirishima's job to feed the baby. Bakugo explained that Kirishima had filled the baby with food and had gone to change, claiming the baby had won this battle against Red Riot. Kaminari laughed, not surprised that the baby had attacked Bakugo with food again. Seeing that Bakugo was almost finished with the little food that had survived, Kaminari decided to pick up the baby to clean his cheeks. Bakugo glanced sideways to ensure Kirishima hadn't returned yet. He didn't want Kirishima to know about the topic he intended to discuss with Kaminari. He was unsure how to start, but Kaminari was the only Omega he knew, and he felt somewhat desperate. Noticing Bakugo's expression, Kaminari sat the baby in his lap, giving him a toy to chew on as his teeth were coming in. He asked if something was wrong. Bakugo hesitated, unsure if it was something they could talk about. Kaminari guessed it was related to being an Omega, acknowledging that Bakugo likely trusted Kirishima more than him, which was understandable. Bakugo felt embarrassed as he confessed that he was unsure how to attract an alpha. Kaminari was surprised and somewhat embarrassed himself. He wondered why Bakugo was asking him, the Omega who had no idea how he had won over the muscular and handsome Red Riot. They were destined, yes, but when they finally met in person, Kaminari had been smitten by the attractive and strong alpha. He feared Kirishima would be disappointed in him, an Omega who often made a fool of himself with his quirk. Bakugo noticed Kaminari's embarrassment and wanted to retract his question, but Kaminari seemed to be gathering his thoughts. He asked if Bakugo wanted to take the next step with Midoriya. Bakugo blushed at the thought, clarifying that wasn't exactly what he meant. He simply didn't know if he was doing anything right with Deku. Kaminari, thoughtful, placed the baby back in his chair and decided to focus on his friend, who clearly needed help, even if he wasn't sure he could provide it. He reassured Bakugo that Midoriya wasn't the type of alpha who played around. He was one of the best people Kaminari knew. The fact that they weren't destined meant that Midoriya was with Bakugo because he genuinely liked him. Bakugo expressed doubt, questioning if he was truly enough for Midoriya, the symbol of peace they often talked about. Kaminari raised an eyebrow, curious, knowing that Bakugo hadn't been at UA with them to see that Midoriya was indeed a strong and dedicated hero. Midoriya was also a nerd who adored heroes, with his room filled with All Might figures, often babbling uncontrollably and pulling out a notebook at random. Kaminari still wondered where he hid all those notebooks. He imagined that Bakugo's perception of Midoriya was almost perfect, but they had lived with him for 3 years at UA, brushing their teeth together and sharing the same bathroom. Midoriya was a great person, but like them, he had his silly and absurd moments. Bakugo had to let go of his idealized image of Kirishima to overcome his insecurities. Kaminari assured Bakugo that Midoriya cared for him deeply, noting how he couldn't stop talking about the lovely Omega he was dating. Many in their class were curious to meet the person who had captured the attention of the class nerd. Kaminari found it amusing, having seen how Uraraka and Mina had expressed their desire to meet Bakugo. However, he worried that Bakugo might feel uncomfortable with the idea. Bakugo was taken aback by the notion of being known. He hadn't said anything about it, though Bakugo understood why. He felt a bit more at ease knowing that the reason was that Deku didn't want to make him uncomfortable. Their friends could be quite energetic, and Deku had noticed that Bakugo didn't usually socialize much. Kaminari noticed Bakugo's unease and playfully tapped his nose, pulling him out of his thoughts and causing him to scowl. Bakugo wondered why Kaminari found it amusing to see him annoyed. Kaminari remarked that Bakugo was a good Omega and pointed out his own clumsiness and foolishness. He mentioned that Kirishima was the best alpha and that Midoriya was lucky to have Bakugo. He joked that if Deku didn't appreciate Bakugo, he would hug him and use his 2 million volts on him. Bakugo tried to accept Kaminari's words, but his insecurities crept in. However, Deku had never given him a reason to doubt him. On the contrary, he always made an effort to show that he genuinely wanted to be with Bakugo. Kaminari suggested that Bakugo could be more daring or direct in how he approached Deku. Alphas often liked SBMS Omegas, but Bakugo wasn't like that. Still, Deku seemed happy with his assertiveness, and that thought lingered in Bakugo's mind. Dinner had ended and it was getting late. Kirishima offered to take Bakugo home as he usually did, but this time Bakugo decided to take the initiative that Kaminari had suggested and sent a message to Deku. Mitsuki sat focused on her phone, sending messages, while her son Katsuki was nearby, attentive and curious. Several months had passed, and the relationship between her son and the symbol of peace had blossomed in a way she never expected. She had thought it might be a fleeting thing, not that she doubted her son's worthiness for the hero Deku, but she feared that Deku would be someone who wouldn't appreciate him. Katsuki had even exceeded her expectations by becoming more caring and attentive to the Omega. Whenever he was busy sending messages, she could easily tell who he was messaging. Although she was curious if they would take another step in their relationship, she knew her son was insecure. Still, she believed he was mature enough for a relationship beyond just dating. She sensed that nothing had happened between them when he slept at the Alpha's house. His scent would easily reveal it, although she suspected why. Mitsuki asked Katsuki if he had considered talking to Izuku about what had happened. He looked confused by her sudden question. She sat beside him on the couch, trying to convey her thoughts clearly. Katsuki felt the mood shift as he understood what she was referring to. He didn't want to discuss it with her. He feared being judged for everything that had transpired. He knew it wasn't his fault, but his insecurities lingered. He had rejected his destined partner, said hurtful things, and worried that Deku would be upset and think he was a coward. He shook his head, unwilling to continue the topic. Mitsuki sighed, somewhat skeptical about his reluctance. She insisted it was important for him to talk to Izuku. Katsuki stood up, feeling frustrated, and retreated to his room. Mitsuki, resigned, let him go, but a loud noise soon caught her attention. She rushed to find Katsuki on his knees on the first few steps, his face flushed and breathing heavily. She helped him up, noticing his legs were giving way. He hugged his abdomen, trying to regain his composure. He was in heat. Mitsuki asked if he had taken his suppressants. He nodded confidently. She assisted him to his room, where he quickly hid under his blankets, embarrassed. Concerned, she left to get his medication, bringing him a glass of water. Once he took it, she stepped out to avoid making him uncomfortable. As his mother, his scent didn't affect her, but she understood that heat was an NTMT moment for an Omega, and she didn't want him to feel uneasy with her presence. After some time, she peeked in and saw him shifting uncomfortably beneath the covers. She asked if he was okay, gently pulling back the blanket from his face to see him burying his cheeks into the pillow. He shook his head, clearly not well. His heat was manifesting aggressively, and he hid back under the blankets. Worried, she called his doctor, unsure of what was happening. When the doctor asked if he had been near an alpha or had any emotional or physical relationship, she realized the situation. Katsuki had started dating an alpha less than a year ago, but she believed they hadn't. The doctor explained that his Omega had needs, and without them, the heat would manifest strongly. It would be challenging to calm him down, and the recommendation was to spend time with the interested alpha. If Katsuki didn't want to take that step, they could help with items bearing the alpha's scent. Mitsuki hung up, grateful, and picked up her son's phone, which he had dropped when his heat began. She nervously searched for the alpha's number. Unsure of what to do, she didn't want to expose her son to something he might not be ready for, but it was possible he had been postponing this moment. The more the alpha cooperated, the better it would be for calming the Omega's heat. She called Izuku, who answered, confused, likely surprised to receive a call from Katsuki's number. Mitsuki introduced herself and explained the situation, asking for a favor. She expressed her uncertainty about what to do, revealing that Katsuki was in heat and his suppressants weren't working. Izuku was speechless, quickly leaping onto a building while patrolling, wanting to keep the conversation private. He understood the gravity of the situation. They had discussed it before, but Katsuki still felt intimidated. He was willing to wait, but he feared that it would be Katsuki who would need to give consent. Mitsuki mentioned that it was a possibility and acknowledged Katsuki's insecurities. She asked if he could provide some of his clothes or blankets, as anything would help. Deku felt embarrassed by the idea, knowing it meant Katsuki would likely create a nest with them. He remembered how Katsuki had been hoarding his blankets and pillows, even hugging a pillow during his visits. It seemed Katsuki had sensed something. He agreed and called his agency to inform them of his absence, recognizing the urgency of the situation. The longer he waited, the more Katsuki would suffer. He quickly went to his apartment, gathering some clothes, including a few shirts and one of his pillows. When he arrived at Mitsuki's house and knocked, she opened the door, smiling shyly. He showed her the bag of items and she gratefully accepted it. Mitsuki expressed her appreciation and invited him in, but she worried that the scent might affect him. Izuku reassured her that he had brought his mask, knowing that if he caught a whiff of Katsuki's scent, he might lose control. However, he felt that Katsuki needed him. Mitsuki, still skeptical, realized that refusing would cause her son more suffering than simply allowing Izuku to help. She accepted, and Izuku put on his mask, which filtered the air. He entered the room, asking her to wait while he went to see Katsuki. As he stepped inside, Katsuki lifted his head, recognizing a familiar scent approaching. Izuku presented the items, and Katsuki eagerly grabbed them, quickly spreading them across his bed. He covered himself with the blanket Izuku had brought, hugging the pillow tightly and retreating beneath it. Mitsuki noticed that this helped, but Katsuki still shifted uncomfortably. She could see him blushing and whining softly, reading his lips as he murmured, "Alpha." She sighed, resigned, and asked if bringing his alpha would make him feel better. Katsuki nodded enthusiastically. Mitsuki understood that her son's Omega side was different from his usual aggressive personality. It was impossible to deny that he looked like a child asking for a toy. He went down to see Izuku, letting him know he had permission to come up. He promised that nothing bad would happen. He mentioned this before. Heading upstairs, not wanting the alpha to think poorly of him. Mitsuki nodded and went to the kitchen to give them space, though she hesitated, fearing something might go wrong. Nervously, Deku entered the room and noticed the figure on the bed stirring. He peeked in and saw the Omega wrapped in a blanket, hugging his pillow. He felt a rush of warmth at the sight, but the Omega quickly grabbed his arm, pulling him closer with an anxious expression. Deku felt terrible, realizing the Omega seemed to be pleading for attention. He sat on the bed and tried to join the Omega in his makeshift nest, feeling flattered that all those clothes belonged to him. The Omega quickly settled onto him, burying his face against Deku's chest and purring softly. Deku felt as if he might faint. He had thought Kaken cuddling with him while sleeping was cute, but this surpassed all his expectations. He embraced the Omega, watching as he smiled and seemed to calm down, inhaling Deku's scent and running his hands over his chest. Deku understood the pleading look in Kaken's eyes, even without words. It was easy for him to interpret the Omega's expressions. He adjusted himself, allowing the Omega to hide in his arms, listening to his heavy breathing. Deku knew that the Omega wanted him to help fulfill his needs, but he felt it was Kaken speaking through him. He didn't want their first time to be like this, without Kaken fully consenting. Yet, the Omega continued to rub against him, clearly trying to attract the Alpha with graceful movements. Deku was grateful for the mask. Without it, he might have lost control. The sight before him was driving him wild, and he couldn't imagine that the sweet scent surrounding them would be ineffective against his instincts. Kaken pressed his lips against the mask, looking up with tears in his eyes while clinging to Deku's neck. Deku thought it was just a tantrum, but when he saw the tears falling like waterfalls, he felt awful. Kaken clearly wasn't okay. He wrapped his arms around the Omega's waist, trying to console him, though he knew it was a small comfort. He listened to Kaken's breathing and attempted to wipe away his tears. The Omega brushed his lips against Deku's shoulder and bit down gently. Deku winced but allowed Kaken to continue when he noticed it seemed to soothe him. He turned Kaken beneath him, watching as he gasped softly, barely audible. Deku tried to gather his thoughts, forcing his mind to take control and not let his instincts take over. He reluctantly removed his mask, and the intoxicating scent overwhelmed him, causing him to growl at the Omega in a deep, dominant tone, making Kaken shrink back against the sheets. He leaned down and kissed the Omega passionately, who seemed delighted by it, wrapping his arms around Deku's neck and pulling him closer. Deku gripped Kaken's hips tightly. He pulled away and kissed the Omega's neck, sking gently, listening to his heavy breaths. He stepped back to admire his work, noticing a reddish mark on Kaken's neck and briefly imagining how Mitsuki would react. He pulled away from the neck before making a rash decision and simply smiled at the Omega. He told Kaken that he loved him and that he would be there with him. The Omega nodded, still blushing and with great effort, tried to communicate something with his hands, though it was difficult. Still, Deku managed to understand him. He smiled and told Kaken that he loved him too. He put his mask back on, knowing that if he remained exposed to the sweet scent, his instincts would eventually take over. He let the Omega hide again, inhaling his scent, and embraced him, deciding to let him sleep on his chest. Kaken was still panting, clearly in pain, but being close to his Alpha helped a lot. Deku knew it would be challenging, but he had to be there for him. Kaken stirred and purred contentedly, inhaling a captivating aroma that made him feel as if he were floating on clouds. He didn't want to wake up or leave this beautiful dream, reminiscent of the nights when Deku would hold him close in his apartment. He continued to purr softly, blushing at the thought of Deku. He wanted more than just sleeping together. They had been dating for a few months, and he believed it was time to take the next step. The idea of letting Deku create chaos with him was tempting, but he feared that Deku might think he was rushing things. There was also the lingering worry that Deku might abandon him at some point. As these negative thoughts surfaced, he began to wake up, but the soothing aroma calmed him. He lifted his gaze and realized he was in Deku's arms, who still seemed to be asleep. Kaken felt a wave of embarrassment wash over him. His room still had a youthful touch, filled with figures of All Might and Deku, posters, and other items he should have discarded as he grew up. Living with his parents meant his room hadn't changed drastically like it would have for someone who had moved out and become independent. Then he started to think deeply about why Deku was there. Suddenly, it hit him he had gone into heat. He sighed, feeling a bit anxious about whether his Omega had given in and enjoyed their first experience together. However, he felt normal, still dressed, and as he shifted his hips, he noticed everything was relaxed. Relief washed over him as Deku squeezed him while yawning awake, smiling at him. Kaken felt himself blush even more, unable to contain himself as Deku cupped his cheeks and kissed him. Kaken sighed as Deku cornered him against the bed. If he had to say something about Deku, it was that he kissed incredibly well, drawing out multiple sighs from him. Deku's tongue explored his mouth without hesitation, and his large hands wrapped around Kaken's slender waist, pulling him closer and lifting his hips. Kaken gasped when Deku finally pulled away, feeling more than just embarrassed. He had to admit it was the best way to wake up, especially after having thoughts about wanting Deku to do everything he desired. It felt as if the closest deity to him was listening. Deku confessed that even though Kaken's heat had ended, he still loved his scent, hiding his face in Kaken's neck. He felt guilty and conflicted, thinking about how he had wanted to devour Kaken since he woke up. He had stayed the night, and when he noticed Kaken's heat finally dissipating, he had removed his mark as it had become uncomfortable, managing to control his instincts. But feeling Kaken purring and wriggling happily in his arms made it hard to hold. But Kaken felt embarrassed, knowing Deku had seen him at his most vulnerable. Yet, Deku remained there, never hurting or taking advantage of him. Perhaps it was because his heat had just passed, but he also wanted to escalate things a bit. He nervously suggested they could do more, unsure of how to express his desire. He wanted to convey that he wished for Deku to take him without restraint, but he didn't even know if that was the right thing to say. They had been together for months. When was the right time? Moreover, they were not marked, and they were certainly not married. The thought of a mark hit Deku like a bucket of cold water, and he noticed Kaken's scent becoming rough and dry. It was clear that something had overwhelmed Kaken, causing him to shrink back at the thought. He was not Deku's destined partner, and there was no reason for a mark. Deku wouldn't do it because that would imply a bond that was ideally eternal. But if Deku were to leave with his destined partner, it meant never marking Kaken or marking him and then abandoning him, leaving him with the painful void of a fading mark. Both options felt unbearable. Deku asked Kaken what was wrong, concern evident in his voice, but Kaken shook his head, afraid to discuss the topic. He didn't want to pressure Deku. A part of him feared that mentioning it would make Deku leave, clearly indicating that a real union between them was not an option. He watched Deku sigh, worried that he might be upset for not sharing his thoughts, but then Deku kissed him on the forehead and embraced him. Deku expressed his love and desire for their relationship to truly work. Hearing Deku's declaration of love sent a flutter of butterflies through Kaken's stomach. It sounded so beautiful and warm. He vaguely remembered Deku saying it during a moment of passion, and it felt even better now that he was fully aware. Kaken replied that he also loved Deku but wanted to take the next step, knowing that he would never be marked. Deku took Kaken's hands, kissing them, and Kaken sighed, surprised by the gesture. Deku's intense gaze locked onto his eyes. He heard Deku's sweet voice, but beneath it, he could sense a possessive tone. Kaken never imagined that an alpha would have such a desire for him. Deku didn't hide his feelings. He slightly revealed his fangs and playfully bit Kaken's lips, making it clear that he belonged to him. Kaken gasped at the pleasant sensation and shifted slightly as Deku held his wrists against the bed. Deku acknowledged that they had been together for a few months but knew what the outcome would be, regardless of the time. He assured Kaken that he wouldn't pressure him, but he needed him to understand that he was his Omega. The deep, rumbling tone of Deku's voice stirred something within Kaken, causing him to gasp instinctively. This was a side of Deku he never expected to see. Kaken knew that alphas were possessive and protective, desiring their Omegas intensely, but he never imagined he would be in the position of being the Omega of the symbol of peace. Deku released Kaken's wrists, and Kaken struggled to find the right words to respond, his hands trembling as the butterflies continued to flutter in his stomach. He managed to say that he was indeed Deku's Omega before leaning in to kiss him, wrapping his arms around Deku's neck possessively. Deku held Kaken's waist, their legs intertwining. They wanted to let their instincts flow, but Kaken pulled back, asking Deku to wait. They were still in his house, and despite their parents promising to respect his adulthood, he didn't want to be seen in such a situation. He checked his phone and saw messages from his mother, who had gone to open the flower shop, and his father, who was at work. He sighed in relief, unaware that Deku had also read the messages. Deku pulled Kaken back towards him, and Kaken turned, surprised but admitting he enjoyed it. Deku brushed his lips along Kaken's neck, slipping his hands under Kaken's shirt, playfully caressing him until he reached his chest, pinching his NPL while continuing to kiss his neck. Kaken's breath hitched, and he admitted to himself that he would love to know what Kaken's voice would sound like. He looked up and saw Kaken blushing, trying to hide his face in embarrassment. Deku needed to know how far he could go and promised to do whatever Kaken wanted. Kaken was lost in thought, but the heat of their bodies made it hard for him to think clearly. He feared they might not be ready yet, but when were they supposed to be? Additionally, there was something that Kaken could not ignore, even though Deku had clarified it to him countless times. They were not destined for each other. Kaken had not shared his past, the cruelty he had shown to a boy who did not deserve it. He had cowardly chosen to hurt him, and even though it was said to be not his fault, he too had been a scared child. He could not shake off the guilt he felt about it. However, he knew that eventually, Deku would find out. He doubted he could keep that secret forever, so he wanted to be selfish and at least hold on to the beautiful memory that his first time would belong to Deku. Deku nodded and lifted the Omega to sit him on his lap. It was not the way he had imagined their first time would be. He had fantasized about something cheesy and romantic, perhaps after a candlelit dinner or in a lovely hotel. But honestly, no matter how it happened, as long as it was with Kaken, it was all Deku needed. He made it clear that if anything made Kaken uncomfortable or if he needed him to stop, he should pinch his left shoulder. He urged Kaken not to hold back, assuring him that if he wanted to stop or felt regret, he would not be upset at all. Kaken nodded confidently and kissed Deku, signaling that he wanted to continue. They kissed, and Kaken shifted as Deku caressed his waist and hips. He enjoyed the closeness, feeling himself pressed against the bed as Deku removed his shirt and placed kisses on his chest, exploring the sensations that made the Omega squirm with pleasure. Deku took off his own shirt and noticed Kaken's eyes widen. He felt reassured by this decision and leaned in, teasing one of Kaken's nipples while playing with the other. Kaken sighed, responding to the attention on his chest. Deku listened to his breathing and decided he wanted to make his Omega melt. He slipped his hand beneath Kaken's pants and noticed he was already aroused. Kaken wanted to stop, feeling embarrassed. But as Deku began to massage him, he could only gasp and sigh. Deku could hear his soft sounds and looked up to see Kaken trying to maintain control, even without words. He was sure the Omega was overwhelmed with pleasure inside. As he lowered Kaken's pants, the Omega felt embarrassed, knowing it was the first time Deku had seen him like this. He feared disappointment, as he did not have a body as defined as the symbol of peace. He was slender with a small, curvy waist. He exercised but not to the extent Deku did. Yet the alpha liked his lips, filled with desire for Kaken and his body. Deku turned Kaken around, catching him off guard, but when he felt Deku's tongue exploring him, he gripped the sheets tightly. A deep sigh escaped his lips, and even though he could not scream, his gasps were loud. Deku pushed as far as he could, and Kaken's body responded well, beginning to naturally lubricate. Deku removed his pants and boxers, pulling out a condom he always carried in case this moment came unexpectedly. He could not take any risks. He put it on and positioned Kaken on his lap while the Omega was still trying to catch his breath. Deku did not want to give him a moment to think or stop feeling pleasure. He carefully took Kaken's hips and began to enter him slowly. Kaken grimaced at the initial discomfort and hugged Deku's neck, biting his shoulder to cope with it. Once Deku was fully inside, he focused on Kaken's nipples to help soothe him. He played and SED while the Omega sighed. Deku trailed kisses along Kaken's neck, leaving marks that could be hidden, knowing his Omega likely did not want others to see them. He began to move, guiding Kaken to match his rhythm. He watched as Kaken gasped with each move. The Omega also moved, allowing himself to take some control. As the pain subsided, Deku took hold of Kaken's member, continuing to slide him as he kept moving. He saw the look in Kaken's eyes, filled with tears and gasps, his mouth open in a silent cry. The sweet scent of both of them filled the room, and Kaken was certain that if he could speak, his cries would echo throughout. Deku kissed him and squeezed his glutes, increasing the friction as he moved with more force. Kaken clung to Deku, trembling as he finally reached his peak, but Deku did not stop. He was not finished and did not want to lose the sight of Kaken just yet. He gripped Kaken's hips, digging his fingers into his skin, lifting and lowering him quickly. Kaken bit down on Deku's shoulder, feeling the intensity of the moment. He tried to calm his racing heart, feeling as if it might burst, but his body felt so warm and satisfied. It was a sensation he would not trade for anything. Deku kissed him and carefully withdrew, setting the condom aside and searching through his pants on the floor for another one. Kaken, I'm not done with you yet. I know, come here. He slept peacefully, feeling tired yet quite well. After all, Deku had let him rest after one of their now frequent encounters. His first experience opened a new perspective where his Omega could not live without being embraced by Deku's Alpha whenever possible. He had not known this side of himself, where intimacy was a part of their relationship, and they enjoyed it in a romantic way. Deku always sought every possible way to make him sigh and lose his sanity. They had shared their first experience together a few months ago, and on that afternoon he tried to hide it, but his mother easily deduced that his blush was due to something that had happened that morning. He did not question it further, grateful for her advice to take care of himself, which prevented her from prying into his private life. He stirred and purred, hugging Deku's pillow, inhaling his scent, which he loved very much. He woke up feeling the absence of Deku, wanting him there to provide warmth while he slept. He got up to search for him, wearing only Deku's shirt over his underwear. As he stepped out, he heard Deku talking to someone in the hallway. Curious, he peeked out and realized it was Shoto. They were both reviewing a stack of papers, discussing a case that Deku had mentioned he was working on with his friend. Deciding not to interrupt, he understood it was work, and although he wished they could be cuddled up in bed, the late hour indicated they had a lot to do. However, before leaving, he overheard something that caught his attention. Deku mentioned he had decided to take Shoto's advice and seek out his destined partner. Shoto responded positively, noting it was something he should have done a long time ago. Deku expressed his nervousness but acknowledged that if he wanted things to go well, it was something he needed to do. He wanted to take the next step with Kaken. They had been together for almost a year, and Deku felt there was no reason to wait any longer. Perhaps more time would have been appropriate, but Kaken was the Omega he wanted to be with for the rest of his life. Yet he remembered the lingering doubt about his destined partner and wondered if that person was happy or regretted their past decisions. He simply wanted to meet him to finally close that chapter and let go. Kaken retreated to the room, feeling despondent. He knew this day would come sooner or later. He had always known it. No matter how much he tried to deceive himself, he understood that this would eventually happen. Deku would leave him for his destined partner. He searched for his clothes, dressing while still crying and trembling. He slipped out the front door unnoticed, needing to leave without facing Deku. However, Deku heard the door slam and peeked out, worried someone might have entered. He quickly went to check on Kaken, only to find he was gone, along with his belongings. Concerned, he told Shoto to wait as he needed to go out. He grabbed a simple hoodie and followed the scent of his Omega. Upon reaching the street, he saw Kaken on the sidewalk, likely trying to message for a taxi. He approached him and, despite the dim streetlights, noticed he was crying. Deku asked what was wrong and why he had left in such a hurry, noting the danger of being out at this hour. He tried to wrap his arms around Kaken to shield him from the night's chill, but Kaken stepped back, shaking his head. He declared that it was over. Deku, incredulous, watched as Kaken continued to cry, his hands trembling as he struggled to communicate. Kaken avoided his gaze, making it clear he did not want to meet Deku's eyes. Deku questioned how Kaken could say such a thing, reminding him that he was his Omega. He wondered what had changed, what he had done to cause this sudden shift. Just hours earlier, Kaken had professed his love. He gently held Kaken's face, trying to make him look at him, but Kaken turned away, knowing he could not face Deku without breaking down. Kaken insisted that it would never work, that they were not destined for each other. Understanding dawned on Deku. Kaken must have overheard his conversation with Todoroki. He tried to explain that it was not what Kaken thought, but before he could finish, the taxi arrived. Kaken raised his hand to silence him and hurriedly got into the vehicle, leaving Deku feeling helpless. He wanted to stop him, but he knew he could not force Kaken to stay. Kaken had every right to end their relationship, regardless of the reasons. But that did not mean Deku agreed with it. He was devastated and returned to find Todoroki looking concerned. As Deku explained what had happened, Todoroki understood why things had unfolded this way. Deku lamented that he should never have considered seeking his destined partner, knowing it had always made Kaken insecure, and he had only pushed him away. Todoroki urged him to pursue Kaken now more than ever. Confused, Deku realized that this was the very reason Kaken had fled. He had finally decided to move forward and be with Kaken forever, only to lose him while trying to close a chapter he was uncertain about. Deku questioned how Todoroki could suggest such a thing. Kaken left because he believes that if Deku finds his destined partner, he will abandon him. He suggested that Deku meet this person, and if he rejects them, it would prove to Bakugo that his love for him is genuine. However, if they end up together, then Bakugo made the right choice in leaving before things got worse. Deku was surprised by this perspective. He had never considered the possibility that meeting his destined partner could lead him to leave Kaken. Yet, even if he rejected this new person, it would only affirm his true feelings for Kaken. With that in mind, he decided to accept Todoroki's proposal and hoped that Kaken would understand. When Kaken arrived home, he tried to calm himself before his parents noticed his distress. However, he heard his mother coming down the stairs, concerned. It was late at night, and she hadn't expected him to return at that hour. Upon seeing him so upset, she approached him with worry. "Sweetheart, what happened?" she asked. Kaken simply stated that he had broken up with Deku and then rushed to his room. His mother was at a loss for words and decided to give him space, but she couldn't shake the fear of what might have caused this situation. She had thought they were in a good place, especially since it seemed Kaken was ready to take the next step with Deku. Days passed, and Kaken didn't come down for breakfast. Mitsuki went upstairs to check on him, surprised by his absence since he was usually an early riser. When she entered his room, she found him still under the covers. As she peered in, Kaken sneezed, and she realized he had a cold and a significant fever. It seemed he had caught something from a customer, so she suggested a visit to the doctor. They waited for the results, with Mitsuki accompanying him mainly to help translate. He had a cough, sneezes, a fever, and nausea, prompting the doctor to recommend a thorough checkup since it was winter and his condition could worsen. "The good news is that you came in early for treatment," the doctor said. "Given your condition, a cold could be quite risky." Kaken looked confused at the doctor, prompting his mother to ask for clarification. "What do you mean, doctor?" she inquired. "Perhaps you haven't noticed because he would have mentioned it earlier, but you're 3 weeks PR gin and tea. Congratulations." He was pacing nervously, trembling and on the verge of tears. His mother watched him with concern and got up from the sofa to calm him down. They had just returned from the doctor, and Katsuki couldn't find a way to settle his nerves. His mother urged him to stay calm, explaining that strong emotions could harm the baby. Thankfully, the medication had eased his cold, but there were other factors to consider. He nodded and took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but he was still agitated and frightened. He needed to tell Izuku, but he shook his head and tried to pull away, only for his mother to grab his arm and insist he stay. He couldn't leave things unresolved. She reminded him that Izuku had the right to know, but if Katsuki had been hurt, she would understand why he didn't want to share. It also depended on whether he wanted to continue with this. He hadn't thought about that before, and he could see it in her eyes. His son had ended up with his destined partner, and maybe he didn't want anything to do with him anymore. He had no idea what had happened, but he had to respect Izuku's decision, so he questioned it. He was unsure, feeling overwhelmed. He didn't want to face this alone, but he also didn't want Izuku to be with him just because of the baby. His mother reassured him that he wouldn't be alone, promising support no matter what decision he made. This made him feel a bit better, but he was still processing everything. They had taken precautions using protection, but accidents could happen. They had been NTMT often, but this wasn't how he envisioned it. He would be lying if he said he didn't have dreams of starting a family with Izuku, but now that Izuku was going to be with his destined partner, there was no place for him and their future baby. He cursed under his breath. He didn't want to face this alone. Exhausted, he decided to go to bed. He glanced at his phone and saw numerous messages from Izuku. He had ignored them since the night Izuku left, and now he couldn't bear to face him. Meanwhile, Izuku sighed as he checked his phone, still waiting for a response from Katsuki. He knew he shouldn't pressure him, but he couldn't just sit back and do nothing to win him back. He resolved to act quickly, believing that the sooner he did something, the sooner he could resolve the situation. He had asked for permission to review the quirk registry under the pretense of working on a related case. He understood he shouldn't misuse his power, but as a hero he had access to it, and he couldn't ignore Shoto's suggestion. He searched through the records for individuals around his age, which yielded many results. He filtered the list by classification, recalling that Katsuki had an explosive quirk. His destined partner had mentioned that he created explosions with his hands, so he used that keyword in his search. Fortunately, the computer system helped him filter the results efficiently. Many names appeared, but he decided to focus only on those starting with a K. Only one name came up, and it had several attached files. Surprised and concerned, he felt a knot form in his throat, nervous about opening the file. The only registered individual with an explosive quirk and a name starting with K was Katsuki Bakugo. Gathering his courage, he opened the file, feeling a mix of anger and offense. Katsuki didn't have a quirk. He didn't speak. Had he lied? But as he read on, his negative thoughts dissipated, and he felt terrible for even considering them. The documents revealed that at 4 years old, Katsuki had been registered with an explosive quirk, but by 8, the information had been updated to classify him as quirkless, accompanied by a police report. He read it repeatedly, piecing together the story. The document stated that he had been kidnapped by an Omega trafficking ring. Testimonies from Katsuki, some officers, and even the criminals aligned, indicating he had been forced to reject his destined partner to increase his value among alphas. The medical report confirmed this, stating that Katsuki had undergone a procedure to remove his vocal cords to prevent any communication with his destined partner, and he had also sustained an injury to his wrist. Izuku struggled to process all of this. He stood up and closed everything, feeling the urge to flee, unsure of what to do with this information. He began to understand why Katsuki hadn't wanted to discuss the topic. He comprehended it fully now. It explained why Katsuki hadn't suspected him completely. Izuku didn't have a quirk, and Katsuki must have grown up with that idea. It was painful and cruel. It must have been a horrific experience for him. He had lost so much, while Izuku had grown up believing his destined partner despised him. Finally, he stopped to confront the reality. Katsuki truly was his destined partner, his Omega, his everything. Even though fate had cruelly separated them, they had found each other and fallen in love. He decided to seek out Katsuki. When he arrived, he knocked anxiously. Mitsuki opened the door and, upon seeing Izuku, was unsure how to react. Izuku expressed his need to talk to Katsuki. Mitsuki hesitated, mentioning that Katsuki didn't want to see him. Izuku insisted that Katsuki believed he would leave for his destined partner, but that wasn't true. He needed to speak with him. Resigned, Mitsuki called for Katsuki without explaining why. When Katsuki came down and saw Izuku, he wanted to retreat back to his room, but Izuku approached and took his hand. He urged Katsuki to listen to him. Katsuki was paralyzed with fear, worried that Izuku might sense something about his PRDSY, though his nerves might give him away. Mitsuki left to visit the flower shop, trusting that everything would turn out well between them. Izuku told Katsuki they needed to discuss what had happened the previous day. Katsuki interrupted, saying that it couldn't be. Izuku took Katsuki by the waist and embraced him, feeling that he was everything he loved in this life. Katsuki sighed and blushed. Despite his attempts to deceive himself, he couldn't deny it. When Izuku held him, he felt as if he were floating. Izuku explained that he had always believed that if he knew who his destined partner was, he would leave with him. Today, he had investigated and found out, but he stumbled upon something unexpected and needed Katsuki to listen before misunderstanding everything. Katsuki looked at him, troubled, feeling a knot in his throat. He feared that Izuku had found his destined partner, something he had anticipated. Noticing Katsuki's melancholic expression, Izuku approached, cupping his cheeks, kissing his forehead, and asking him to sit down. He began to explain that as a child, he hadn't had a quirk. For reasons he would explain later, he had obtained a quirk before entering high school. Katsuki listened, confused by the conversation. Izuku shared that children had called him useless, but his destined partner had made him appreciate his nickname, Deku. He didn't have a quirk, and he rejected me, saying he didn't want me because I was quirkless. Kaken trembled, unsure of how to react to that conversation. He looked at Deku, who seemed confused. What he said didn't make sense to him. He mentioned that he could create explosions with his hands, so I searched for someone with that ability, and it seemed I had already found them. Deku smiled at him, and Kaken felt his cheeks grow warm, shaking his head in disbelief. He couldn't comprehend what Deku was telling him. He wondered how Deku knew all of that. Did my mother tell you? Kaken felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. He had avoided the topic for so long, but the truth was out there, and it was easy to piece together. He couldn't process it all and found himself embracing Deku, who was crying inconsolably. As Kaken stepped back, he feared Deku would blame him, hate him, or hold a grudge. Deku noticed his distress and expressed regret, admitting that he had acted out of fear. Kaken took Deku's hands, trying to convey his happiness through a smile, simply grateful to be with him. He told Deku that despite everything that had happened, their connection proved that he had always been his destined partner. Kaken kissed Deku again, feeling a mix of emotions. He pulled away, needing time to process it all. He felt as if he were in a dream, worried that he might wake up to find Deku gone, with someone else. But Deku continued to smile enthusiastically, soothing Kaken with gentle touches and kisses on his cheek. He expressed his fears about losing his quirk and his voice, worried that Kaken would be angry or disappointed in him. Deku noticed the negativity in Kaken's words and, feeling a bit irritated, lifted Kaken onto his lap while embracing him. He urged Kaken to stop making excuses, acknowledging that while it had hurt, he had always known it wasn't Kaken's fault. Kaken leaned his chin on Deku's shoulder, holding him tightly. He couldn't shake the news from a few days ago. He wondered how Deku would react to it. They were just boyfriends, not even marked, and the thought of a baby felt overwhelming. But if it was with Deku, he wanted to embrace it. Deku noticed Kaken's nervousness, sensing it was about something else. Kaken seemed to struggle to find the right words, his hands trembling. Deku asked if Kaken was still having doubts about their bond. Kaken shook his head and stood up to face Deku, deciding to focus on the results of his recent tests instead of letting his nerves get the best of him. Deku looked confused, thinking Kaken might be about to flee. But Kaken quickly returned with an envelope in hand. He explained that he had been sick recently and had undergone tests, handing the envelope to Deku. As Deku opened it, he felt a surge of worry, glancing at Kaken, who was blushing and appeared downcast. When he read the contents, it felt as if his heart had been pierced, and his throat went dry. He looked up at Kaken in disbelief, who seemed embarrassed and somewhat despondent. Deku stood up, and Kaken's heart raced with fear that Deku might refuse or ask him to terminate it. He didn't know how to react if that happened, but he couldn't bear the thought of losing Deku now that there were no more doubts. But then Deku lifted him, unable to contain his joy as he cried out happily. He exclaimed that they were going to have a puppy, expressing that while it was unexpected, he wanted everything with Kaken. He was overjoyed and declared his love. In that moment, Kaken felt the weight lift off his shoulders. He embraced Deku tightly, allowing him to celebrate their news. After so long, he finally felt at peace, knowing that his alpha and destined partner would always be there for him. He whispered back that he loved Deku too. He sits and can't help but smile. He feels quite good, not believing that the news has really caused such a stir. Kirishima and Kaminari keep congratulating him, while Deku blushes nervously at their comments about taking good care of both Kaken and the baby, or else the hero couple would make him pay. He insists that he would never do anything bad to Kaken, let alone the baby, feeling offended. Kaminari playfully threatens him with the ladle he was using to prepare dinner. Kirishima laughs at the sight of his Omega being so assertive with Deku, while Kaken finds it amusing to see Deku in a panic. Kirishima and Kaminari had invited Deku to dinner as they usually did, but this time he mentioned he would bring Deku along because they wanted to tell them first. After all, it was thanks to Kirishima that they had found each other. Kirishima expresses his surprise at the fact that they are truly destined for each other, proudly stating that his insistence did not fail. He always knew they were meant for one another. Deku thanks him for the 1000th time, nearly in tears. He admits that it was a surprise for him as well, confessing that he had thought they might be destined for a while, but things didn't align until they finally learned the truth. He says this somewhat melancholically but ends with a smile. Kaken watches him, feeling a bit guilty. After all, he was the one who had hidden his past from Deku, and had he shared everything from the start, things might have been clearer. Noticing Kaken's expression, Deku takes his cheeks in his hands and kisses him. Kaken blushes at the sudden gesture and pulls away, embarrassed that their friends are watching. Deku tells Kaken to stop having negative thoughts, and Kirishima laughs at his friend's reaction. Kaken, annoyed, pushes Deku, but it doesn't faze him at all. Kaminari returns with his phone in hand, smiling nervously. He asks where the little one is, and Kaken, feeling a bit anxious, admits he has a strong desire to hold the baby since the invitation. Kirishima mentions that the baby is with his parents, as they wanted to have an adults-only dinner. Kaminari seems to understand Kaken's disappointment upon hearing this. Kaminari apologizes, saying they didn't know Deku was expecting. Had they known, they wouldn't have planned it. Kirishima curiously asks why it matters, and Deku appears confused as well. Kaminari sighs, realizing how oblivious alphas can be sometimes. He recalls that when he was expecting, he couldn't stay away from Mina to play with her baby. Kaminari notices the serious looks on their faces and feels embarrassed. Kaken blushes at being called out, but he admits that knowing this gives him relief. He thought something was wrong with him. He enjoyed playing with Kaminari and Kirishima's baby but had never felt such a strong urge until now. Kaminari nervously states that he should apologize. Everyone looks at him in confusion. He explains that he accidentally mentioned to Mina that they would be coming today, and she insisted on inviting herself. This leads to a chain reaction of invitations, resulting in a large group arriving in 10 minutes, all curious to meet Deku, now also recognized as destined, though they are unaware of that last detail. Kaken feels overwhelmed, trembling at the thought of so many people arriving. Deku takes his hand to help calm him down. Although they are friends of his destined partner, Kaken wonders if Deku really wants them to meet him. He knows they are destined, but they don't know he is quirkless and mute, while they are heroes ranked highly in society. Deku thinks about the situation. He is excited for his friends to meet Kaken, but he doesn't want to put his Omega under any stress. He wants them to know Kaken, but he is aware that Kaken struggles with strangers. He watches Kaken's nervousness and how he hugs his belly as if that brings him comfort. His friends are unaware of many things. They are destined, Kaken is expecting a child, and Deku has plans he wishes to share when they have a moment alone. He gently takes Kaken's cheeks to look him in the eyes, needing him to be honest. He expresses his excitement about his friends meeting him, emphasizing that Kaken is his destined partner, but if he feels uncomfortable, he doesn't want to put him through that stress. He asks if Kaken truly wants to meet them. "I will understand if you don't. Of course, we are going to have a baby. You are my destined one, my Omega. Kaken, I want to shout to the world that you are mine." Deku smiled and kissed him to calm his nerves. Kaken nodded. If Deku had no problem, he could handle meeting them. Kaminari complained to Kirishima about his lack of romance, and Kirishima looked offended. He pointed out that he had given Kaminari flowers that morning. Kaminari retorted that it was only because Kirishima had called him chubby. Kirishima clarified that he had only doubted whether Kaminari's UA hero outfit still fit him. Deku and Kaken watched their friends bicker, knowing it was just their way of teasing each other. They quickly ended up laughing, more affectionate than before. "By the way, are you going to tell them about the PR Jin and CY?" Kirishima asked curiously, wanting to avoid mentioning the secret. Both Deku and Kaken looked thoughtful. Deku genuinely wanted to share the news with everyone, but he was unsure how Kaken felt about it. They hadn't discussed it in detail. Kaken wasn't marked, and they weren't married, which could lead outsiders to misinterpret their relationship. They had been dating for almost a year, and he didn't want Kaken to feel uncomfortable. Kaken noticed Deku's hesitation, but Deku smiled again and embraced his belly to show his support. It's your decision. If it's something you'd like to share with your friends, I have no problem, but… Kaken paused, trying to find the right words. His hands trembled slightly, and Kirishima lifted Kaminari by the waist. Come on, I think we should prepare some drinks. They left the two alone, and both were grateful for the gesture. Tell me, Kaken. I know I'm your Omega, but the reality is that I'm not marked, and we aren't married. I fear everyone will think you're with me because of this baby, and they might hate me for what I did to you. That last thought left Deku deep in thought. His friends knew he had been rejected by his destined one, but they didn't know the details, and he couldn't share everything. The idea of Kaken being rejected was terrifying. He cared deeply for his friends, but Kaken was his everything. Regarding the first part, I didn't want to mark you yet until, well, we got married. I wanted it to be something very special for both of us. Although I bought the ring a couple of months ago, I hadn't found the courage to ask you. I plan to do it after this dinner and take you somewhere beautiful, but if I don't do it now, it might be too late. Kaken looked somewhat confused by what Deku was saying, but Deku knelt down, not caring about the situation. He blushed deeply when he showed Kaken the contents of the box he had been carrying in his pocket. Do you want to marry me? Kaken was incredulous, feeling a whirlwind in his stomach as his cheeks burned. Deku was just as nervous and blushing. He had been thinking about this for months. Honestly, if he could have, he would have proposed the moment they met. He managed to say it even though his hands trembled. Resigned, he embraced Deku, letting his kiss be the answer. He couldn't contain his happiness. Deku helped him put on the ring, and he looked at him excitedly. Seeing his Omega happy was all he needed in this world. They had returned from the kitchen with the drinks they promised, providing an excuse for the couple to talk privately. Deku was seen happily crying as he hugged Kaken around the waist, burying his face in his shoulder. Kaken noticed the gazes directed at them and simply raised his hand to show the ring. Kaminari nudged Deku to take the spotlight and congratulate Kaken, causing Deku to sigh in resignation. They heard the door, and everyone turned curiously to see who among their friends had arrived first. Kirishima indicated that he would open the door and headed toward it. A couple of voices were heard as Uraraka, Ida, and Todoroki entered, greeting everyone in a familiar manner. Kaken decided to simply wave, not wanting to make things awkward, but Deku took him by the waist and pulled him close to introduce him formally to his friends. He introduced Kaken to Uraraka and Ida, who greeted him warmly. Shoto was already familiar with Kaken, making their interaction a bit more comfortable. Uraraka playfully complained about how Todoroki had met Kaken first, which made Deku laugh nervously. Ida scolded Uraraka for being competitive among friends. The door chimed again as Tsuyu entered and greeted everyone cordially. The night continued, and with the arrival of the rest of their friends, Deku felt encouraged to share the good news. He mentioned that they were expecting, and his friends couldn't contain their excitement, congratulating them wholeheartedly. Kaken was somewhat surprised by how well everyone got along and that his presence didn't seem to bother them. Then Deku shared something he hadn't expected would elicit such a reaction. He expressed that it might sound strange and hard to believe given the coincidences, but they had discovered they were truly destined for each other, making everything better than he had imagined. He hugged Kaken from behind, inhaling his sweet scent. However, Kaken felt the weight of the gazes from the others and noticed the restrained expressions on Uraraka, Tsu, Ida, and Todoroki. They exchanged glances and congratulated their friend, while the rest of the group seemed genuinely happy for them. Deku remained oblivious to the tension, but Kaken sensed that their reaction was not entirely positive. Kaminari noticed this and decided to engage Kaken in conversation, allowing Mina to express her excitement about their love story and how they had reunited as destined partners. After all, she only knew that Izuku hadn't met his destined one, just like most of the class. Ida and Kirishima chatted with Deku, while Uraraka took the opportunity to join Mina's conversation. She asked what they were discussing, and Mina explained that Kirishima had mentioned he was the one who introduced them, but she was curious about their first date and what followed. Uraraka looked at Bakugo, waiting for his response, knowing he could only communicate through his phone, but she noticed his fingers trembled slightly. Uraraka playfully mentioned that it had been many years since Deku decided not to date anyone, asking how Kaken had convinced him. Mina eagerly encouraged Kaken to answer, suggesting that if Midoriya accepted, he must have sensed something romantic. Kaken sighed, trying to formulate his response, aware that Uraraka and perhaps some of Deku's other friends knew about how he had rejected Deku when they were children. He recalled being attacked on his way home and how Deku had intervened, striking the Alpha before he could harm Kaken. At that moment, he hadn't been able to communicate with Deku or realize he was the hero Deku. Mina smiled at Uraraka, commenting on how romantic that sounded, but Uraraka only managed a strained smile. Todoroki arrived and stood beside Uraraka, expressing surprise that they were truly destined. Despite the many coincidences, he emphasized that as friends of Midoriya, they should support him in his decisions and wish him well. Kaken noticed Todoroki's serious demeanor, sensing he wasn't entirely pleased. Since meeting him, Todoroki had been a good friend, but Kaken could tell that this situation caused him some discomfort, even as he tried to keep his emotions in check. Kaken felt overwhelmed, as if everyone was judging him. Ida and Tsuyu hadn't spoken directly to him, but he could sense their disapproval in their sidelong glances. He wanted to leave. Feeling heavy and anxious, he didn't want to impose any further, but Deku seemed genuinely happy sharing the news with his friends. Kaken pretended to head to the kitchen for water to distance himself. Noticing his absence, Deku excused himself to follow Kaken. He asked if Kaken was okay, sensing his distress. Kaken forced a smile and nodded, claiming he was just tired from the PRDNCY and considering calling a taxi home. Deku insisted on driving him, reminding him that he had planned to stay together since Kaken would be moving in a few days. Kaken knew Deku wouldn't let him go alone, fearing it would seem like he was trying to push Deku away. Just then, Kaminari entered, nervously suggesting that Kaken could rest in his room and that Midoriya should accompany him. If Kaken continued to feel unwell, they could leave, as most of them understood what dealing with a PRDCY was like. They both accepted the suggestion, and Kaken took the opportunity to leave with Deku. Kaminari returned to his guests, addressing them sternly. He told them that this was his house and they wouldn't treat his guest poorly due to their misguided ideas. He looked at Deku's close friends, who didn't seem entirely remorseful. Kaminari pointed out that they didn't understand anything, asking if they expected him to be happy for them, knowing how much Deku had suffered because of Kaken. Uraraka and Tsuyu acknowledged that they understood they needed to respect Midoriya's decisions, but they had witnessed how painful it was for him when his destined partner had rejected him. The rest of the guests looked on curiously, not fully grasping the situation, as Siro intervened, sensing the atmosphere becoming tense. He asked what was going on. "I thought we were having fun. Midoriya always said he couldn't be with his destined partner, and now he is getting married and starting a family. Isn't that the best news?" Most nodded in agreement, but Deku's friends didn't seem convinced. Todoroki mentioned that he liked Bakugo, but he knew Midoriya had truly suffered. Kirishima decided to join the conversation after Kaminari pointed out their friends' clear behaviors. He acknowledged their feelings but emphasized that they didn't know the context of the situation or everything Midoriya had gone through to get to this point. Ida was interrupted as Deku entered the room, visibly upset. He asked what was wrong, expressing his confusion over why they weren't happy for him. He had left his partner alone to find out why they were acting this way and making his Omega uncomfortable. Deku's anger surprised everyone present. It was rare to see him like this. Uraraka found the courage to speak up, stating that they simply didn't understand how he could forgive Bakugo after everything he had been through. The others supported her, and Deku took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He understood their point, knowing he had contributed to the misunderstanding over the years by feeding the idea of his destined partner. However, his friends had a skewed perception of how things truly unfolded. He explained that he couldn't share details because it was personal for Bakugo, but things hadn't happened as they believed. Tsuyu pointed out that Bakugo had cruelly rejected him, said horrible things, and broken their bond. She questioned how that could be justifiable. Deku struggled to keep his frustration in check as he insisted that it was indeed justifiable. He asked if they thought he was foolish enough to forgive someone who had truly hurt him. He urged them to trust him and recognize that Bakugo was not the person he had described years ago. Kirishima chimed in, affirming that he and Kaminari understood the context because Bakugo confided in them. He assured them that it was entirely justifiable. He had seen Bakugo's love for Midoriya, and he believed him when he said there was a valid reason for his actions. Kirishima resolved to focus on the present. Todoroki decided to accept this perspective. He had witnessed Midoriya's suffering firsthand regarding his destined partner, but he also saw how the relationship with his Omega healed those wounds. He believed that Midoriya's forgiveness wasn't solely based on his feelings for him but rather because Bakugo genuinely deserved it, or perhaps there was nothing to forgive. He asked if Midoriya promised that his forgiveness wasn't just because of his feelings. Uraraka looked at Deku with concern, unsure if everything was truly all right. She didn't want her friend to get hurt, especially with a baby on the way and their recent engagement. She had heard the story of how they met and their many dates. Deku radiated love for his Omega, but she feared that love had blinded him to the pain he had endured. Deku reassured them confidently, stating that everything had been a tragedy that couldn't be avoided, but now they were together after both believing they would never meet. His friends accepted this, albeit with some embarrassment and insecurity, worried about seeing him cry for his destined partner again. They realized they had been foolish regarding the Omega, who was clearly feeling insecure around them. Kaken felt dizzy and unwell, trying to push away thoughts of everything that had just happened. He sensed that Deku's friends didn't want him around, which he had anticipated, but the realization hurt more than he expected. He shifted uncomfortably, feeling nerves in his stomach, and hugged himself to regain control. He felt tears threatening to spill, likely due to the PRGN-CY hormones. Suddenly, he was hit with a wave of nausea and rushed down the hallway to the bathroom, where he knelt and retched. The combination of stress and PRGN-CY was overwhelming. He heard footsteps behind him and cursed himself for not closing the door, but the footsteps faded away, and another wave of nausea hit him. Uraraka entered with a glass of water, urging him to drink, warning that he could hurt himself if he continued like this. He accepted the water reluctantly, but the nausea returned. She handed him a damp towel, which he used to wipe his face before sitting on the toilet to catch his breath. She offered her hand to help him back to the bedroom, but he hesitated, knowing she was one of the friends he felt least comfortable with. She encouraged him to avoid the bathroom scents that would only worsen his nausea. Resigned, he tried to stand, but dizziness struck again, and his legs gave out. Uraraka quickly caught him, using her quirk to stabilize him, making it easier for her to help him back to bed. She mentioned checking if Kaminari had any crackers and that she would go find Deku. Noticing the confused look on Kaken's face, she sighed, realizing she had been inconsiderate. She apologized, explaining that the last time Deku spoke seriously about his partner, he had been in tears. Kaken felt a knot in his throat and stomach, knowing Deku must have suffered because of him, yet he refused to share just how bad it had been, likely to spare Kaken's feelings. The thought made him tear up, and he recognized that the hormones were contributing to his emotions, but knowing Deku had endured pain overwhelmed him. Uraraka approached him, taking his hand in an attempt to calm him down. She reassured him that when Deku had met him, he had never smiled so brightly or spoken of love so openly. Whatever had happened, Deku clearly loved him despite everything, and if he had forgiven him, he likely hadn't done anything wrong. Kaken nodded, trying to calm himself, not wanting to harm the baby with his turbulent emotions. He decided to go find Deku. Uraraka left, and Kaken, still feeling nauseous, made his way back to the kitchen. He noticed the door to the backyard and stepped outside, needing fresh air. Although it was dark, the streetlight provided some illumination. He took deep breaths to calm his nerves, hoping the nausea would finally subside. Hearing footsteps, he turned to see Deku smiling at him. Kaken returned the smile, not wanting Deku to notice he had been crying. Deku approached and hugged him from behind, pulling him close. Kaken admitted he had been feeling nauseous, feeling a bit embarrassed. Deku chuckled softly and tightened his embrace. Kaken was puzzled by this but felt relaxed as Deku brought his hand to his nose, inhaling a strange scent that soothed him to the point of drowsiness. Deku caught him as he began to slump and lifted him into his arms. He carried Kaken to the vehicle where a couple of others were waiting, laying him down in the trunk and adjusting him so he wouldn't be jostled too much during the ride. After closing the trunk, he transformed back to his original form. Toga remarked on how efficient he was, to which he replied that years of practice had made her so. They discussed the importance of Kaken, noting that his worth was significant. Dabi mentioned they still needed to find the highest bidder to cause some trouble for the symbol of peace who had created so many issues for them. Meanwhile, Deku had entered the room to find Kaken and take him home to rest, but he was nowhere to be found. Uraraka suggested checking the bathroom. They returned to the kitchen, noticing Kaken's scent and the open back door. They called out for him but found no sign of him anywhere. They went back to their friends, who were laughing and drinking some alcohol that Mina had brought. They asked if anyone had seen Kaken. Deku expresses his frustration, and everyone looks concerned. They stand up and decide to help him, but after a few minutes, they realize he is still missing. Deku begins to panic, prompting Todoroki to call the police to report the situation and initiate an official investigation. He blames himself for leaving Kaken alone. Kaminari, feeling anxious, points out that he suggested Kaken go to his room, indicating that someone must have known they would be there. Kirishima proposes they head to his mother's house, fearing that whoever took Kaken might return to harm them. Kirishima recalls that there is a camera in the backyard and mentions seeing the door open. He shows them footage from the last half hour, revealing that Deku was the one carrying Kaken away. This revelation shocks everyone, as Deku insists he was with them the entire time, but someone who looked just like him had taken Kaken. Kirishima reminds them that there is only one fugitive with that quirk, and she has plenty of reasons to seek revenge against Deku. Frustrated, De feels his control slipping. The police suggest they go to the station to gather information on the remaining members of the villain league who are still at large, including Toga. Deku accompanies the police, with Todoroki, Kirishima, and Ida joining him to lend their support. He is filled with anxiety and anger, overwhelmed by the thought that his Omega, his destined partner, his everything has been kidnapped, and his life is clearly in danger. He worries about what they might do to hurt Kaken where it would hurt the most and prays they do not know about the baby. Kaken sat hugging his knees, unable to stop crying. His body ached and he felt chills. Ever since he was taken to that eerie doctor, he had been experiencing an overwhelming pain in his stomach. He heard footsteps and trembled, fearing he would be hurt. A couple of men entered, and Kaken pressed himself against the corner of the bed, trying to avoid their reach. The men discussed the success of extracting his quirk and how they needed to wait for his connection with his destined partner to break it and start the auction. They speculated about the value of an Omega like him, noting that their clients paid well for an obedient and efficient Omega. Without his quirk or connection, they could guarantee that he was one of the best commodities they had acquired. Both men were alphas. One of them grabbed Kaken and lifted his nightgown, exposing his small frame. Kaken looked at them, trying to defend himself by attempting to create a small explosion, but nothing happened. They laughed, dismissing his efforts, and tossed him back onto the bed, leaving him trapped once again. He grabbed a blanket and covered himself, sobbing harder. He heard the voice of his destined partner in his head, asking why he was crying. Kaken trembled, knowing that if they realized he could hear them, they would only hurt him more. He reassured Deku that everything was fine, even though he felt anything but. He had lost his freedom since being locked in that room, and he wanted to delay the inevitable for as long as possible. In those moments, Kaken understood why everyone around him felt pity for him for being an Omega. At least he had a good quirk. He dreamed of being a hero like All Might. That was the only good thing he had, and now it was taken from him. All he had left was Deku, and those brief moments of peace were all he craved. He continued to sob, trying to muffle his cries so Deku wouldn't worry. He just wanted to escape. Kaken asked if Deku was home, and Deku replied that he had just arrived home after a long day. Kaken took a deep breath, gathering his courage. He simply wanted to be with Deku. He asked if he could sleep over that night. Deku agreed but expressed concern over the suddenness of the request. Kaken explained that he just wanted to be with him. That admission made Kaken blush, and he tried to calm his nerves. It was just sleeping after all. It had been a long time since he felt such peace while sleeping, especially in Deku's arms. However, after that experience, his nightmares had intensified, reminding him of his lost destined partner. Every night, he trembled, longing for safety in the embrace of the Alpha. He managed to convince his mother, promising he wouldn't do anything inappropriate with Deku. He knew Deku was an adult, but the topic still made him nervous. When Kirishima dropped him off at Deku's apartment, Kaken was grateful that Deku understood his intentions. Deku offered him pajamas and helped him settle into the sheets. Kaken expressed his enjoyment of the moment, wishing Deku would stay over more often. He didn't want to leave his hiding spot to respond, so he clung to Deku tighter, seeking comfort. He felt safe and protected, wanting to remain in that embrace forever. The thought of Deku leaving, whether to his destined partner or due to his past, filled him with dread. All he wanted was to stay in those arms forever. Kaken felt dizzy and heavy as he woke up, realizing he was in a chair with his hands tied behind his back and his ankles secured. He looked around, feeling anxious as he recognized he was in a dark, empty room, dimly lit by a single bulb with no windows. He tried to remember what had happened last, and the image of Deku holding him tightly and giving him something that made him drowsy flashed in his mind. He trembled in fear, questioning why Deku would do that. No, Deku would never hurt him. Suddenly, the door opened, startling him. It was Deku, but something felt off. Kaken wanted to speak, but with his hands bound, it was impossible. Deku approached him, cupping his cheeks and roughly wiping away his tears. He smiled in a way that sent chills down Kaken's spine. Kaken struggled to break free from his grip. Deku spoke in a strange tone, asking what Kaken liked most about him. Kaken was terrified to see his alpha acting this way. He heard footsteps behind him and another person entered. The newcomer told Deku to leave Kaken alone, stating he wouldn't respond anyway. The woman, who had a similar smile to Deku's, threw him a bathrobe to cover himself. Kaken wanted to ask who they were and what they were doing there, but he couldn't communicate, and they didn't seem to care. They discussed needing to act quickly because the buyers would arrive soon, and they needed the money to escape. Kaken felt a knot form in his throat, wanting to vomit. He felt like he couldn't breathe, and when they left him alone, he began to panic. He recognized those words. He had heard them when he was 8 years old, believing he would never experience something like that again. Just before being auctioned off, the police had found the place where he was held with other Omegas. Now, he was in a similar situation, wanting to scream for Deku's help but unable to. The feeling of suffocation overwhelmed him. Then he remembered his condition, and it seemed they were unaware of it. He sighed in relief, fearing they would hurt him if they found out he was P-Arginin-T. He tried to calm himself, waiting for Deku to save him. Deku was desperate. He hadn't slept all night and was now with the police, reviewing all the investigation documents. They knew that those who had taken Kaken must be fugitives from the League of Villains, but he was troubled by why they specifically targeted Kaken. He understood that the League hated him, but they weren't the type to seek revenge. An officer entered and informed them that a couple was looking for Kaken. Deku trembled at the thought of facing them. He stepped outside, feeling ashamed for not protecting Kaken. Mitsuki approached him, her hand raised as if to strike him, but she held back, knowing it wasn't right to blame him. Deku didn't stop her. He felt he deserved it. He promised to find Kaken, stating that villains were likely aware of their relationship. They didn't know all the details yet, but he wouldn't rest until he found him. Mitsuki expressed her fear of losing her son, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her husband for comfort. Deku felt a knot in his throat and urged them to return home, assuring them he would take care of everything. The officer called him over, revealing that a villain he had incarcerated a month ago claimed to have information about the case. Deku decided to speak with him. When he arrived at the interrogation room, he saw the villain smiling arrogantly. The villain stated he would only talk if they promised to reduce his sentence. The officer responded that it would depend on whether the information he provided was useful. The villain huffed in annoyance but seemed willing to cooperate. He mentioned being invited to an auction months ago, where the merchandise was the intended target of hero Deku. Deku slammed his hand on the table, grabbing the villain by the collar in anger. He demanded to know how he could refer to Kaken as merchandise. The villain explained that many in the league despised Deku, but they saw Kaken as a vulnerable civilian. Deku released him, trying to control his inner turmoil. He pressed for details about the auction, and the villain revealed that they wanted to ensure buyers were secured, knowing that Deku would come looking for Kaken. They planned to sell him within 3 days. When asked if he knew where it would take place, the villain admitted he didn't but could provide names of those participating, suggesting they follow one of them for guidance. Deku accepted the information, leaving the interrogation room in frustration. The atmosphere around him was tense, no one dared approach him. His fierce aura was a clear reflection of his concern for Kaken. Kaken was to be auctioned off, caught in a situation that had caused him immense pain before. Now that Deku was a hero, he felt powerless to protect him. It was a painful déjà vu, and he had no excuses left. Hours pass and they feel eternal. No matter how hard he tries to calm himself, he trembles in fear. He feels suffocated by terror as they return for him, dragging him through several hallways. The gloomy place surrounds him, and as they reach a door, he knows everything ends there. They enter a large room filled with shadows of various people, but he cannot identify any of them. They make him stand in the center, illuminated by a single light, becoming the center of attention for all. One of the villains announces that he is the destined Omega of the symbol of peace, questioning how much they are willing to pay for the honor of owning him and his life. He wants to flee but knows there is no escape. He lowers his gaze, trying to hold back tears. He does not want to appear more vulnerable than he feels, listening to the laughter and insults directed at him. They all hate Deku and therefore, they hate him. He knows that each of them intends to hurt him without exception. He hears them shouting numbers, offering increasingly higher amounts for him, which only brings back painful memories. Several alphas command him to kneel, and his body moves involuntarily. He falls, wincing from the sudden movement, and their laughter only increases the offers. One of the villains approaches and unties his hands, leaving him confused. The villain uses his alpha voice on him, commanding him to undress. Desperate, he covers his ears, trying to fight against his Omega instincts. Only the annoying shouts penetrate his resolve. The alpha grabs his wrists, lifting his hands above his head. One of the villains activates his quirk, singeing a part of his abdomen, causing him to sob. The crowd erupts in excitement at the scene. The villain shouts again for him to undress, and when he releases him, he collapses to the ground, overwhelmed by pain and the pressure to comply. His baby is at stake, and he begins to sob as he removes his jacket, his hands trembling while the alphas cheer him on. The offers continue to rise, and he wishes for it all to end, but they are interrupted by a loud crash that silences everyone. One of the villains curses and approaches him, lifting him up. He struggles, but the villain grips his wrists tightly while holding him against his waist. They search for the source of the noise, and when they see a wall being destroyed, they realize they have been discovered. The villain declares they need to leave, dragging him along as they weave through the chaos of heroes entering. The villains attempt to flee or fight back. One of them threatens him with his quirk close to his face, warning him to calm down or face dire consequences. Kaken nods, knowing that being incinerated might be a better fate than what awaits him with them. A wall of ice appears in front of them, forcing them to stop. The villain seems irritated but recognizes the quirk. Todoroki appears behind the wall, destroying it with flames. Todoroki warns them to stop making things difficult, preparing to use his ice against the villain. The villain yanks Kaken to use him as a shield, causing Todoroki to hesitate, fearing for Kaken's safety. Kaken struggles to break free, but the villain tightens his grip, causing him pain. Todoroki watches, frustrated, knowing the villain could easily harm the Omega. Suddenly, the villain feels a light blow to his back, and his body becomes weightless as Uravity pulls him down, slamming him to the ground with her quirk. She quickly moves away, taking Kaken by the arm to pull him to safety while Shoto covers them with ice. She asks if he is okay, and Kaken nods, but she notices his wrists and realizes he is not fine. They need to get him out of there, but a greater crash echoes, and several villains fall to the ground. Others approach, and Uraraka urges Kaken to stay behind her. He feels himself being pulled away as Deku lifts him, and he looks at him in disbelief, trembling in fear. His Omega is scared of him, yet Deku pulls him along forcefully. They need to leave immediately, and Deku uses his commanding voice. Kaken wants to resist, but Deku drags him along. He wants to call for help, but no heroes intervene, believing he is the symbol of peace. None of Deku's friends are nearby, they are all fighting behind. He feels desperate, sobbing and struggling weakly. His wrists burn, and he is too weak to do anything. He sees the door and knows that if he crosses it, he may never have another chance to be found. He sees Deku's smile, knowing it is Toga, but his Omega is terrified of him, of her, of everything. He does not want to hold on to that image any longer. He wants to scream for Deku to leave him alone, but they hear a thud as Toga pulls him in front of her. Kaken then finds himself facing Deku, who looks furious. Kaken stands between them as Deku glares at Toga, who smiles wickedly, embodying the essence of his alpha. Toga threatens Deku, warning him that one wrong move could hurt Kaken. Deku growls in frustration, and Toga laughs at his reaction. She tightens her grip on Kaken's neck, and he struggles to break free but cannot. Deku shouts for her to let him go, but Toga only tightens her hold. Deku knows that if she wants to, she could easily break his neck and desperately searches for a way to stop her. An Omega like him does not deserve to live. You disgust me. He whispers this into her ear using his alpha voice, and with that, he lunges forward, feeling exasperated. At this rate, she would end up hurting someone. He knows she doesn't leave anyone alive. But Toga loosens her grip and stops moving, allowing Froppy to take hold of her waist with her tongue and throw her against the wall with enough force to render her unconscious. Deku watches the scene in shock, stopping just in time to avoid using any attack that could harm his Omega in a moment of distraction. He sees his friend against the wall, apparently having used her camouflage. I filled her with my poison without her noticing. Now, bring out your destined one. We will handle the rest. Froppy leaps away, and Kaken is about to fall, struggling to catch his breath while coughing. Deku catches him, trying to lift him, but the Omega instinctively tries to pull away in fear. Deku looks at him with concern, unable to fathom what could have caused such a reaction. It's me, love. I'm so sorry. He says this in the sweetest way possible, also using sign language to reassure him that it's really him. Kaken sees this and feels a wave of relief, pulling him into an embrace, tears streaming down his face as he tries to keep his Omega from wanting to flee. Deku lifts him into his arms and holds him tightly for protection. Deku leaves the area before exposing his Omega to any more of the situation. In the hospital, they are separated, and he feels frustrated to notice that his Omega seems relieved to be away from him. He curses under his breath, suspecting that Toga used his face to hurt him. All he wants is for his Omega and their pup to be safe. Deku waited outside his room, hesitant to enter for fear of triggering another outburst from Kaken. He felt frustrated, upset, and quite worried. At least Kaken's parents were with him. He knew that having them around would help him feel safe. Todoroki and Kirishima arrived after dealing with the situation, and it had already been 24 hours. Kirishima asked how Kaken was doing, concern etched on his face. Deku sighed, trying to gather his thoughts. He explained that Kaken was in a bad state, having suffered greatly from Toga using his face, which left him scared. Both Todoroki and Kirishima exchanged worried glances. Kirishima wanted to see Kaken, but he understood that Deku should be the first to approach him. Todoroki then asked about the baby, and Deku grimaced, sitting down and expressing his frustration. The baby was in a critical condition and could not endure more stress, or it could be lost. Due to the burns on Kaken's wrists, communication was difficult, and his parents had redirected the conversation. The doctor feared that knowing about the risk could add to Kaken's stress. Deku struggled to hold back tears, clearly affected by everything, especially the rejection from his destined mate. Both Todoroki and Kirishima offered him a comforting embrace, which he accepted. He couldn't find solace with Kaken, who was unaware of the risks associated with his Pardon. Mitsuki emerged and noticed the three of them looking worried. She approached Deku, who still seemed embarrassed about the situation he had put Kaken in. She informed him that Katsuki wanted to see him. Deku hesitated, recalling how the last time he entered Kaken's room, they had to sedate him due to panic. He didn't want to hurt Kaken with his presence. Mitsuki reassured him that Kaken was calmer now and that he knew Deku was not the villain in this situation. She insisted that it was Deku's responsibility to explain things to Kaken. Masaru then indicated that Deku could go in. Though hesitant, Deku stepped inside and felt a wave of relief upon seeing Kaken sitting there with a serene expression. Their eyes met, and Kaken's fearful gaze made Deku's heart ache, prompting him to cry. Deku moved closer and embraced Kaken, who nestled against his chest, trembling but inhaling Deku's comforting scent to calm himself. Deku spoke softly, expressing his sorrow and promising that he would not allow anyone to hurt Kaken again. He pulled back slightly to cup Kaken's cheeks and pressed a gentle kiss to his lips, which brought a sense of peace to Kaken. It was a sweet and warm kiss, reminiscent of the affection Deku often showed him. Deku noticed the bandages on Kaken's wrists, neck, and parts of his chest, fearing there might be more injuries. Kaken, despite the pain, attempted to communicate through gestures, but Deku looked on in confusion. Kaken tried again to move his hands, expressing that he didn't feel like a good Omega. Deku couldn't let Kaken believe that. He took Kaken's hands in his own and smiled reassuringly, affirming that Kaken was his destined mate and that they were going to marry. He urged Kaken to forget what Toga had done, insisting that it wasn't him. Kaken nodded but held his abdomen, feeling unwell since waking up. He had been hurt multiple times during his ordeal, and despite his efforts to protect the baby, he hadn't succeeded. Deku noticed Kaken's distress and tried to keep him calm, assuring him that everything would be all right and that he had taken a break from work to be there for him. Kaken felt guilty, believing it was his fault that he had been taken and that their baby had been harmed. He regretted leaving Deku alone, knowing it had put them all at risk. As he cried against Deku's chest, he clung to his clothing with the little strength he had, desperately seeking comfort. Days later, Kaken was discharged from the hospital, and his parents agreed to his request to stay close to Deku. He needed to regain Kaken's trust, but he was unsure if it was the right decision. Still in bed, he cried and didn't want to leave. When Deku entered with a tray of food, Kaken felt no appetite, believing he was failing as an Omega. Deku urged him to eat, explaining that he needed proper nutrition for both himself and their baby. Kaken remained silent, unwilling to confront the reality of his situation. He felt inadequate as an Omega for Deku. Deku gently took Kaken's face in his hands, noticing the tears still streaming down his cheeks. He could see Kaken's hands trembling, knowing he wanted to say something but was holding back. Kaken's muteness was not a barrier for Deku. He loved him just the same. Yet, their communication had faltered, and Kaken clearly wanted to avoid discussing the matter. He forced himself to eat and rest, all to avoid losing his puppy, but he still seemed devastated. More than 2 months had passed, and he knew it would take much longer to overcome what had happened. He feared that Kaken might want to run away from him again. He understood why his Omega had taken time to stop being afraid, but he knew many things she had said were likely still lingering in her mind. He reassured her that when she was ready, they would begin planning the wedding. No matter how long it took, he would wait. Kaken looked at him in surprise, trembling with fear. He thought that Deku would eventually tire of him. He didn't know if he would ever be okay, but he saw Deku's sincere smile and wanted to believe it. He finally communicated with Deku, who was surprised by what he said. Deku took his hand and looked at the ring he had given him, smiled, and gently kissed Kaken, slowly wrapping his arms around his waist. Kaken sighed as Deku leaned him back onto the bed. Continuing this tender action, he heard his Omega sigh, and when they separated, he saw Kaken blushing. Kaken expressed that he had always believed he had lost Deku, and now that he was here, he didn't want to lose him again. Kaken took the initiative and kissed Deku, needing to feel close to him. His Omega still felt abandoned for some reason. Deku hadn't touched him beyond kisses and hugs while sleeping. Kaken appreciated the space Deku had given him but also needed to feel desired. Deku easily understood and didn't hold back. He missed being able to feel and touch his Omega in a way that made him sigh. It was the image he had always loved to see, yet he wanted to proceed slowly and with great care. He loved his Omega and knew he needed to give him all the love and understanding possible. They were going to marry and start a family. He didn't want to lose them. Kaken wanted to retreat, to distance himself, but he couldn't. He felt the firm hands of the person around his neck, tightening their grip, making it hard for him to breathe. He wanted to plead for them to stop. Instead, they smiled at him and abruptly took his cheeks, kissing him forcefully. Kaken was already in tears as he felt the bite, and the other person pulled away, laughing. That laughter only filled him with more fear. After all, it was still Deku's face. Toga seemed more amused than anything, enjoying the desperate expression on the Omega's face. She slapped him hard, slightly taken aback by her own strength. She had forgotten that Deku's quirk was still difficult for him to control, and now the Omega's lip was bleeding. The Omega trembled, struggling to maintain his composure, but he couldn't shake off the fear, especially since she, along with the image of Deku, was the cause of it. Compress and Dabi arrived, looking somewhat irritated. Toga was warned not to damage the merchandise. She dismissed the concern, stating that he wasn't a virgin and they never promised to deliver him without a scratch. She recalled when Deku had rejected her outright and belittled her, which only annoyed Dabi further. Compress decided to leave, reminding her to keep him in one piece and that by the end, he better not have that irritating face still intact. Kaken trembled. This was not Deku. Even though he looked like him, Deku would never truly hurt him. As Toga approached, she untied his ankles. He wanted to get up and run, but she grabbed him by the neck, lifting him before throwing him back to the ground. She wondered how good of an Omega he was, teasing him about whether he would obey her commands using Deku's voice. Kaken turned his gaze away and closed his eyes, trying to ignore her. He didn't want to be swayed by her face and voice, but even her scent was the same. Toga then took his shirt and began to unbutton it, causing him to tremble and squirm. She commanded him not to move, using an authoritative tone that left him unable to refuse. He felt her firm and tense body against him. As long as there were no visible marks, it wouldn't affect the price. She approached him and bit into his chest while gripping his hips roughly. The strength of her hold and the bite made him sob. He couldn't scream. Toga paused to see the blood from the mark she left, her hands clearly imprinted on his hips. It was a shame he couldn't scream. It must be boring for Deku to take him like this. She then reached into his pants, and he squirmed uncomfortably, begging her to stop, to leave him alone. But the person in front of him, wearing Deku's face, ignored his pleading gaze, moving her fingers inside him abruptly, causing him to cry even more. The Alpha found it dull and continued her actions, moving closer to bite his neck again, leaving another bleeding mark. It was truly boring that he didn't scream. Finally, she withdrew her hand, running it over him and taking his cheeks roughly, leaving marks from her sharp nails. She taunted him, questioning if anyone would really want him, declaring he was defective and horrible. With that, she emphasized her last words, using Deku's authoritative voice, making Kaken tremble. His Omega was wounded, shattered both physically and mentally. Even though he tried to convince himself that this wasn't Deku, his Omega seemed unable to fully grasp it. Toga finally transformed back to her original form, putting on her coat as she left him desolate on the ground. He didn't want to think about anything, but memories of his childhood flooded back, reminding him of how he had hurt Deku, and now Deku had hurt him. He knew he had, to some extent, deserved it. But this wasn't Deku. No, it wasn't. Yet, just thinking of him made his body tremble in terror. He felt like an 8-year-old boy who had lost everything. All he wanted was for his destined partner to rescue him from this nightmare. He was nervous, his hands trembling as he hugged his belly, a faint blush on his cheeks and a nervous grimace on his face. He looked down and fidgeted with his fingers, trying to calm them. The time for his DLVI could come at any moment, and he feared he wasn't ready for it. He would meet his little one, and he didn't believe he deserved that honor. Kaken reassured himself that everything would be fine. Deku took his hand, noticing his boyfriend's anxiety. They were sitting on the sofa in Deku's apartment, now their shared home. Deku was taking a break to be ready when Kaken needed him. That was his only priority. They weren't married yet. Kaken wanted to wait until after the baby was born. Unfortunately, after his kidnapping, it had become a high-risk PRDNCY, making a wedding too stressful for him. But what if he wasn't ready? Deku admitted he didn't feel ready either, but he was eager to meet their child. Kaken nodded, but his nerves remained. He had read many parenting books, and many mentioned something he could never do, which he feared would negatively impact his bond with his baby: talking to the baby. Talking to the baby in the womb was essential, and he felt unable to do it. He tried to express himself in other ways but felt it wasn't enough. He worried that when the baby was born, it wouldn't recognize or want him. Deku tried to convince him that it wouldn't be a significant issue, but no matter how much he tried to reassure him, the thought lingered. There was nothing he could do about it, especially when the contractions began. His fear escalated, and he shook Deku's arm in panic, who looked equally worried. They needed to get to the hospital. Deku lifted him into his arms, determined not to let him take a single step or be alone during this clearly frightening process. Once they arrived, he held Kaken's hand tightly, allowing him to squeeze it as much as he needed. Deku didn't complain. He simply encouraged him and gently stroked his head, trying to calm him in any way possible. He watched as Kaken grimaced, puffed, and cried. Deku felt helpless, unable to find a way to ease his Omega's suffering. But Kaken knew Deku wanted to be strong for him. He longed to hold their baby in his arms soon. After hours of labor, Kaken finally succeeded, and when they saw their child, they exchanged astonished looks at the tiny creature they now had. Kaken cradled the baby, watching it snuggle against him. He looked up to see Deku, who was crying like a baby himself, unable to contain his emotions. Even the doctors felt a bit embarrassed to see the symbol of peace in such a state. How could he not feel this way? He gazed at the little baby in his Omega's arms, with its blonde hair and green eyes. Deku couldn't keep himself together at the sight of such beauty. It was theirs. Deku said this, and Kaken nodded, burying his nose in the baby's head to inhale the delightful scent. Deku also snuggled close, embracing both Kaken and their baby in his arms. The baby was so beautiful, resembling Kaken but with Deku's eye color. Kaken loved that. He wished he could squish the baby's chubby cheeks, but for now he simply admired the sight of them cradled in his arms. After some time, Deku stepped out and saw his mother with Kaken's parents waiting anxiously. "How are you?" Mitsuki was the first to ask, and the three looked eager for a response. "Very well, it's a boy." "Oh my god, he's so beautiful." Deku couldn't contain his excitement, and he eventually let them in as his phone kept ringing with friends asking about his Omega and baby. He shared everything but denied visits for now, knowing Kaken was still uncomfortable since their meeting. The only one on the way was Todoroki. Kirishima and Kaminari were arriving, having taken time to find a babysitter for their own child. "Where are they? What happened? Does he look like Bakugo or you? How much did he weigh? Can I see him?" Kaminari was the most excited, and Deku tried to answer everything while letting them pass. He feared too many visitors would overwhelm his Omega, but he knew no one in that room would do anything to make him uncomfortable. "How do you feel?" Kirishima finally asked Deku, who smiled and sighed, releasing all the previous stress. "Incredulous and happy. I never imagined I would find myself in this situation. It will take you a few weeks, right?" "Yes, I fear this is too much for Kaken, and I don't want to leave him alone. Rumors are starting to spread. Due to the kidnapping, the press already knows your destined partner is a male Omega and a civilian, but Todoroki and Momo have been handling the rest of the information." Deku sighed, knowing that this ruined the moment, but it was a topic he couldn't ignore, especially now that his Omega was more vulnerable than ever. "Kaken still fears going out alone. I can't let this affect his life any further. Many villains saw his face. Eventually, the world will know who he is." Deku nodded but hoped to postpone it for as long as possible. He wanted to shout how much he loved Kaken, that he was his and only his, but he knew it would be too dangerous and overwhelming for his Omega. They were now two people who were the most precious to him, his Omega and their baby. He returned to them and saw Kaken holding their child, unwilling to let anyone else take him. Kaken growled at his mother, unable to express his frustration verbally. Kaken assured him that no one would take their baby away. He promised. Deku moved closer, sitting beside him and wrapping his arm protectively around him. He understood that Kaken still didn't like being apart from him for too long. For now, Deku would focus on protecting both of them. Both were on their way home. Deku had dropped his son off at his mother's house and decided to pick him up before dinner time. He took his son's hand and noticed he was still enjoying the ice cream he had bought as a reward for being good with his grandmother. Deku couldn't help but lift his little one into his arms, settling him on his shoulders. The small child squealed with delight, thrilled by the height. Deku was tall, and his son loved it when he did this. The little boy asked what his mother was preparing for dinner, and Deku smiled as he replied that it was katsudon. Proudly, he announced it, and his son playfully pinched his cheek, claiming that his mother always made katsudon and that Deku should choose something different. Deku laughed, knowing it was indeed his fault. Kaken always spoiled them both with whatever they wanted to eat, so Deku took advantage of his absence to decide on dinner. The 4-year-old sighed in resignation and continued to enjoy his ice cream. Deku promised him that he could choose the meal tomorrow, trying to make amends. His son rolled his eyes, uninterested, and insisted that he preferred to let his mother choose because it made her happy. Deku smiled at this, leaning down, caught off guard by the sweetness of his child's words, and struggled to maintain his composure. His little one was just too adorable, and the thought of Kaken being happy was overwhelming. Deku admitted to himself that he enjoyed seeing Kaken happy as well. It had been 6 years, and he reflected that if someone had told him before that he would be this happy, he wouldn't have believed it. He had the most beautiful Omega by his side, someone he once thought was impossible to have. His son was the light of his life, and every time he saw him smile, he knew he had made the right choice in following Kirishima to the flower shop where Kaken had worked before they got married. They arrived home, and as Deku bent down to let his son hop off his shoulders, he watched the little one dash into the kitchen, likely searching for Kaken. He saw his son leap into Kaken's legs, wrapping his arms around them. Kaken welcomed him with a smile, lifting him into his arms and showering him with affectionate kisses. The little boy laughed, asking Kaken to stop, but he secretly enjoyed the attention. Deku approached and kissed Kaken's forehead, causing him to blush. Katsuo made a face at the scene and declared it gross before running off to his room, probably to wait for dinner to be ready. Kaken playfully warned Deku not to overexert himself, knowing he loved cooking and carrying their son, but Deku placed a hand on Kaken's rounded belly, causing him to pout. Kaken mentioned that he had dealt with much worse with Katsuo, and Deku regretted bringing it up as he noticed Kaken's expression shift. He reassured him that there was no need to dwell on it. Kaken acknowledged this but couldn't help but feel weak at the thought of not having their child in his arms. Deku took Kaken's hands, intertwining their fingers, and leaned in to kiss him gently, wrapping his arms around him protectively. He whispered that Kaken was not weak. He had faced so much and was a strong Omega who never gave up. Kaken nodded, trying to calm himself, worried that strong emotions might affect the baby. They were only halfway through the PRGNCY, but since they found out, they had been extremely careful. Katsuo, with a furrowed brow that he clearly inherited from his mother, asked Deku what he had done to Kaken. He was an extremely protective child when it came to his mother. Deku reassured him that everything was fine. They were just reminiscing. Katsuo remained skeptical, as his instincts were fiercely protective of Kaken. Deku thought it was fitting, given that Katsuo was an alpha like him. Katsuo had never seemed to mind not knowing his mother's voice. He was always the one helping to communicate with others when faced with new situations. He loved his parents just as much as they loved him. Deku took him in his arms again, placing him on his shoulder. They planned to clean the rest of the house together so that Kaken could rest. Katsuo agreed, and Kaken watched them go with a smile. Kaken leaned against the table, taking a deep breath before sitting down, feeling more tired than usual. His body was struggling with the PRGNCY, but he didn't want to mention it. It was normal for some situations, and he didn't want to be a burden to Deku, who already worked double shifts to make up for the days he took off to care for Kaken. Feeling arms wrap around his waist startled him, and he looked up to see Deku. He whispered that he was there for Kaken, and as long as he breathed, he would never be alone again. They were destined to be together, after all. Kaken trembled, blushing at the words. Tears filled his eyes, and Deku embraced him tightly. Kaken sometimes still couldn't believe that his destined partner was with him, willing to love and protect him. He expressed his fear of being a burden, but Deku reassured him that he had never been a burden. Kaken was the one who kept him alive and motivated to be his best every day. Deku lifted him into his arms and carried him to the living room, settling on the sofa with him. They cuddled close, wanting to enjoy each other's warmth. Katsuo nestled between them, seeking comfort in their embrace. Deku smiled as he watched them, feeling content. Everything was going to be just fine.